Cool. Thank you, everyone, and welcome to the January 26th, 2022 Issaquah Capital Finance Task Force. That's a mouthful. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Unfortunately, Cynthia could not be here, or is unlikely to be able to make it because she's recovering from an orthopedic surgery. So she has passed along comments that I'll be including at different stages of the agenda, but we'll be without our fearless leader, so I'll do my best to step in. So I wanted to start off, this is a pretty pivotal meeting and something that Andrea and Cynthia and I have been spending a lot of time preparing for. And wanted to just talk a little bit about some of our goals for today and some of the things around process that might help us get there. So when we were talking about today, we focused on a lot of the individual elements of the funding strategy. But the key step that we really need to take today is to incorporate those all into a comprehensive strategy. And that's why Andrea had sent out that homework for all of us that I hope we completed around making sure that we're thinking holistically. Obviously, a poll can have one response, but thinking about it holistically and trying to bring together everything with all the competing priorities might have a different result. And so do want to make sure that we all come in kind of with that framing. And we were really thinking about this meeting as we talked a lot about referring to this as kind of building out the skeleton for a recommendation. So a lot of the really big ticket items in our recommendation we do want to cover today. And then our next meeting is really going to be more focused on filling in some of the details around that skeleton. So today is an important day from that respect. And so I think to help us do that, I do want to make sure and stress that we do want to hear everyone's voice in this recommendation. And I know some people have the style of sitting back a little bit more and trying to soak in information before they respond. But today is really the day that we want to make sure all of that knowledge comes back out and it gets shared with the group. And I do think even if it's the minority, you think you're in the minority with your position, the goal of this task force is not necessarily to have one majority opinion that is the only thing that anyone reads. We do want to make sure that everyone's voice on this task force is heard. So please do speak up. I know it can feel kind of intimidating at times, but I do want us all to come in with the comments. One of the things that we had a conversation with the mayor earlier this week, and she was so complimentary of this group and really stressed so much how much she wanted to hear the voices of all the different members of this group. And there was reasons that she picked everyone. So all the different perspectives that are coming together, that's something you can't stress enough. Do want to hear from everyone. One of the things that, given the format and what topics we're trying to cover, I am really going to try to encourage discussion. And so one of the things, and this came in a little bit into our last meeting, if you have a comment in response to another task force member's comment, please indicate that in the chat, and I will try to kind of bundle comments that are together. So say something like comment response to Jamie's comment. I think that's something we did with one of Susan's previous comments, but I do think it'd be helpful just to help us kind of get kind of certain points closed out or have some meaningful discussion. And one other thing is obviously we have limited time. We did extend this meeting by about 30 minutes, but do try to be kind of selective in your wording. And if you're repeating someone else's position, maybe it's as simple as saying, I support X's position on Y, so that we can make sure that we capture that's included, but that we're being sensitive to time, because this is a big agenda that we have today. And then in terms of how we're going to try to bring this all together at the end, we aren't going to have a formal motion process. It's not going to be a unanimous outcome. Basically, what I think Andrea's, I'm going to give this to her task is, and I'll try to help as well, is trying to synthesize what we're saying at the end. And obviously it's not going to be necessarily everyone saying the same thing, but trying to synthesize it down to what she was hearing. And I do think this is where when she restates that, as well as whatever ends up in the minutes, I do think is really important for all of us to make sure that we're comfortable with what that kind of summation or that synthesis is. So with that, I think that is everything I wanted to cover at the front. So I think next up on the agenda are approving last meeting's minutes. And then do I have any comments on those minutes? Hearing none, we will consider those approved by unanimous consent. Next up, or Andrea, do we have anyone signed up to make public comment? For anyone attending from the public?
I don't believe so. And I'm going to ask Juliana to confirm and make sure that's correct from everything she knows on her end.
I haven't heard of any comments, and I don't see any guests in the chat or in the participants.
Great. Well, we will then move on to the heart of our agenda. And I think, Jean, will you be taking us through the first part of this?
Yes, Jean will have the first part. I'm just going to do a quick little intro for Jean to kind of outline the day that we have here. So I think here come the slides. Thank you, Jean. So today, and the next slide, please. Great. So today we're going to kick it off by reviewing the poll results. The poll that you took last time, we had really just a few minutes to take a look at those. And so we want to talk more about those poll results of, and if you recall, those were which tools should we use and when. So we want to go over those results and discuss and make sure people are comfortable with what's there and if there's any changes that should be made. Jean's going to lead us through that discussion. And that's going to be really the first half of the meeting today, is kind of solidifying those recommendations. And then the second half of the meeting today, Robert has provided some information which I sent to you all last night, and also is in the presentation, talking about bond versus pay-as-you-go options. So I'd like to hear what the task force has to say about that. And then there's a bunch of other questions that we have to help form up the rest of the recommendations, including what do we do about ARPA, how should we use those funds, ending fund balance, and a few other things. So we'll walk through those questions and understand what the task force would like to see. There's several polls that are involved in today's meeting to try to get to some of these answers sooner and understand where the general consensus or where the majority of task members are at with some of these items. So that's today. The next meeting, as Jamie said, is really, we're forming majority of the recommendations today. We will then, staff will then go back and finish typing the strategy and the recommendations report. And then for our next meeting, really going over that report. So did we get it right? Did we hear you correctly? Are there things we should change within that report that would make it more accurate? And there's probably a few questions along the way that we'll need to fill in the blanks. And so that's really going to be the focus for the next meeting after this. And then the meeting after that is our last meeting where you'll present your recommendations to Mayor Polly. And I know she has a couple of questions for you all, and that would be your time to make sure that you are heard. So that's kind of what we're scheduled to do. I wanted to make sure to highlight kind of where we are in this process and what we have left on our schedule and agenda. And are there any questions about process or where we are today or where we're headed? Not seeing any, so then I will leave it up to Jean. Take it away, Jean.
Okay, thanks, Andrea. I'm Gene Paul, the management analyst, and as Andrea described, I'll be starting off with our poll results from the last meeting. So since it's been 3 weeks, a quick refresher. We asked everyone for the different revenue tools, if they would recommend them, what time frame would that recommendation occur in, and we kind of broke it down into short term, which was the 0 to 3 year time span, medium term 4 to 6, a long term of 6 to 9 years, and then an outlying period of 10 years plus, or if it simply was not recommended at all. So we had 10 task force members at the meeting, so you'll see for each line 10 total votes. Red light cameras, clear consensus around the short-term use of that tool. For the next 3 tools, TBD Sales Tax, Parks District, and Levy Lid Lifts, there were pluralities with 5 out of 10, but no clear consensus. So we're going to do a little bit of a deeper dive into each of those tools in the follow-on slides. And lastly, for the vehicle license fee or VLF, clear consensus that that tool is not recommended. Before I kind of go on to other slides, one thing I did want to capture on this slide was just for the people who did not recommend the VLF, we're not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about that tool, but we would like to just capture 2 to 3 reasons why that tool is not recommended, so we can identify that for the recommendation report. So I see there's some questions and comments, but I think first if we could just respond to the VLF reasons why, and then we could circle back to the questions and comments.
Gene, this is Jamie. Could we take Susan's question on process first, just to make sure that it's nothing that would be relevant to that?
Sure.
To your first question. Susan, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much. Well, so when I went through and did my homework and thinking about sort of how to start to build out my thoughts on what we've discussed accomplishing, and then I see this as kind of like how we might accomplish it. To me, that they interacted with each other, and so what I use these poll results to inform my thinking about, you know, where people were saying they would like to sort of apply the sources to the uses, and that was helpful. My question here is, why do we all have to sort of align on this data that you're presenting here in the poll? Like, do we have to agree, or should we just use this as, this is interesting, you know, we're seeing this trend, we're seeing that trend, great, now park that, and then let's now move on to the discussion about the uses and then matching up the sources? It seems like we're trying to decide on the sources before we actually get to matching them to the uses. And to me, they're just interactive. And I didn't know if anybody else kind of had that same thought.
Any other task force members have any thoughts on Susan's question? Councilmember Martz?
Yeah, I mean, I've struggled all along because this is what engineers call a coupled problem. And I've thought about the analogy of, if you're thinking about a home equity line of credit, right? You have to figure out how much of a home equity line of credit you want to take, but that's informed by what you might do with it, right? And you know, the magnitude of the kinds of projects you might do. You don't just take out the largest home equity line of credit you possibly can from the bank. You sort of think about, well, what things are important and what's my pain level. And so the idea of how big of a home equity line of credit is intrinsically coupled to what you might do with it. And I continue to have a challenge with this, because as we talk about funding mechanisms, in my head, I'm thinking, okay, you go to the voters and what are you telling them you want to do with this amount of money? So I really resonate with Susan's question. I think if I'm understanding it correctly, it's hard to separate these out and say, I'm going to answer one question first and I'm going to answer the other question next, because really at the end of the day, we have to come up with something compelling to the voters, and then part of that compelling is, what does it cost and what do they get, right? The two things are, you can't have one without the other.
Thank you, Councilmember Martz. Andrea, Gene, before we go any further, any thoughts on that? Any response to the 2 comments?
This is Tim. In the effort of brevity, I would just echo what Tola said. I agree wholeheartedly.
So, so to try to address Susan's question first, I think that's exactly what we're trying to do here. So we're trying to use these polling results to see where task force members are at. That helps facilitate the conversation to flesh out, okay, you know, vehicle license fee seems to be taken off the table. Want to make sure we understand the reasons for that, and then we can talk about how these polling results influenced your strategies that you did for the homework. So we're just trying to, when we have these discussions, we wanted to walk through it in terms of manageable questions, because this is all, it's very complicated. And so I think that your perception, Susan, is exactly correct, that we want to use these polling results to just help focus the conversations today and help inform the questions, because they are linked and they should be, they need to be. That is the point. And so to you know, respond to the concerns over projects and specific uses, you know, we've been talking, as you know, at that bucket level or the category of projects. That's still where we want to have these conversations today. Absolutely, Councilmember Martz, absolutely, Tim Flood. We are headed there to, yes, ultimately, the city would need to determine what to take to the voters and what types of projects that those need to be. What we're looking for from the task force, again, is an understanding of what should we explore first, and we need that narrowed down. And so that's really trying to keep those recommendations high level. I know we've talked about this in the past, but I understand this is difficult. It's a difficult task, and this group is really helping us start down this process of coming up with more specific recommendations, and talking at the project level will be done, talking to voters will be done at a later date as part of this process.
Thanks, Andrew. So am I hearing correctly that you still would like us to answer the vehicle license fee question just as it was not recommended, but then we might spend a little less time on some of the specific feedback around this, and maybe if there's just general comments before we head to the next item? Is that
That
a
would be
fair
great.
summation? Okay.
Yes, thank you.
And then, Jean, did you have anything else prior to the vehicle license fee, getting feedback from the task force on that item?
No, nothing to add. Thanks.
Great. So if you have any comments on why, or maybe if you didn't say that, please indicate in the chat. And Zach, you have a comment.
Yeah, thanks. Zach Hall here. I had voted or indicated not to recommend car taps through the Transportation Benefit District because, well, two reasons. One, there's a whole political atmosphere surrounding it in recent news, and I didn't think it would be a very palatable idea to bring to the public and to the community. And then second, you know, one of the reasons that we talked about, or that this group has spoken in favor of a TBD sales tax in the past, is because there's more of regional equity there. People who are coming in and consuming services in our community here in Issaquah are also paying into the system, whereas the vehicle license fee is simply by registered vehicle owners. So again, that would just be people who live here in Issaquah. So those are the two reasons why I suggested we not recommend it.
Thanks, Zach. Brad?
A little similar to Zach. Overall, I think that this particular category has been flushed out in the overall community to the point where it doesn't seem like there's a lot of support for increase in license fees. And so I voted not recommended because I didn't think that this would really be supported by the community, was my main reason for it.
Thanks, Brad. Any other comments? Great. And so, Andrea, you were just looking for general feedback on the poll results at this point?
Yep, that was perfect. I think Jean was asking the vehicle license fee. One thing that we heard from this task force all through this process is that for the recommendations report and that strategy, that it's important to you that we include the reasons why you're making recommendations. So that's why we just wanted to pause and ask, you know, it's pretty clear, eight votes saying not recommended. We just wanted to hear those reasons so that we can specify them in the report. So thanks, and I'll turn it back over to Jean.
Thanks, Andrea. I am done with this slide, but I did see that Stacy had a comment. So before I move on, I want to make sure that we kind of make sure everybody has a chance to respond.
Yeah, thanks, Gene. Sorry, I missed you, Stacy.
No, that's okay. So I hear that my audio is not very good on this laptop. Is that true? So can you even hear me well enough for me to talk, or should I?
Yeah, we can hear you. It's a little tinny, but it's totally
Okay.
fine.
So I just, I've thought a lot about the red light cameras, and I just kind of said a lot, and I want to clarify, revise, or whatever you want to call it, some of my thinking here. So it's true that red light cameras can be used for public safety reasons. And of course, it's true that if you use them for public safety reasons and there are violations and there are fines paid, then the city has revenue from that. But I think that I don't know that we were put together to think about, revenue for capital projects. And I don't think it's appropriate to think of the red light cameras as a revenue source for purposes of this committee. Even though we know that if the additional cameras were put in either at schools or at intersections and we got revenue, certainly the city council can restrict that revenue to certain uses, which I think is a good thing, and we've already done with the only camera that we have. So I would suggest, or at least my thought is that we don't think of red light cameras as a revenue tool, and maybe we take it out of our recommendations or our report to the city council as a revenue tool, and instead maybe sort of make it a side recommendation. It could be in the report, a side recommendation that the committee recommends that the city council consider, or the city consider, red light cameras for public safety reasons, and the committee further recommends that if cameras were to go in, that the city restrict revenue to, generally speaking, we could say, to transportation projects, and that we think that that's what the revenue should be used for. But I'm thinking that is maybe not appropriate for us to just put it in our report as a revenue tool. It's kind of a side issue. So that's what I've been thinking about a lot, and I wanted to just kind of put that out there.
Thanks, Stacy. Anyone have any comments? Brad?
Yeah, I totally agree with what Stacy just said. And to some extent, it was a summary of what the mayor said in our last meeting, that really shouldn't be, I don't think this should be a revenue tool. It would really send the wrong message, I think, to the community. I think it's a great idea. I think it should be totally safety oriented. And as the mayor pointed out, if there is any excess revenue beyond costs, that revenue should really be fueled back into additional safety issues. That might have some relationship to transportation, I suppose, but it's really safety, safety, safety. And so I just don't think that it's a revenue tool for the top three priority items that we've identified. Loosely, I guess, in transportation maybe, but I agree. I don't think it should be in this as a revenue tool.
Thanks, Brad. And Kathy, do you have anything to add? You said that you agree in the chat. Is there anything you have to add to that?
Thank you. My only other comment would be, I think, and I agree, it should be a separate issue. And I think the city council would be very quick if there were ever revenue funds and there were something that the community really wanted that was safety related, but not on their radar, that they could use any additional funds, whether that be to provide safety measures on a bike lane or better road crossing, pedestrian crossings, anything like that. And I think that city council and the mayor would see those opportunities and apply them as a safety measure.
Thank you, Kathy. Anything else? I think, Gene, you said you didn't have anything else on this slide, so it looks like we don't have any other comments on this.
Okay, I'll move on to the next slide. So as I mentioned on the previous slide, we're going to try and do a little bit of a deeper dive on those 3 tools where there was kind of some consensus or a plurality of preference, but not exactly a clear consensus, I guess is a better way to phrase it. And while we're doing that, we'd also like to kind of take a step back and consider that we've already identified the priorities as number 1 with transportation, and then parks and trails and facilities are slightly lower on that priority scale. So kind of taking a step back with all of those tools, the question there in the center, are we comfortable with recommending all of these tools? So for the TBD sales tax, the park district, and the levy lid lift, we have considered them individually, but now taking a step back and looking at all of them together, is the task force comfortable with recommending all of those tools in the report?
Thanks, Gina. I do think that this is maybe the content that Susan's comment was related to around, do we want to do this in this format, or do we want to do this as part of a general response? Susan, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but was that your and Councilmember Martz and the others that spoke earlier, is that what you were saying?
Because, you know, I guess my answer to, are all of these useful? Yeah, but they're useful for different things and at different times. So I guess that it's just sort of like a superficial answer to say, sure, yeah, there's nothing on here that I would eliminate. But I think the meat of the discussion is, well, when do you use a sales tax, and when do you use a property tax? And yeah, so I think you're correct that that's where I thought we were going to have the bulk of our discussion tonight.
I'll just jump in and say, if you're ready to dive into that conversation right now, you have your strategies ready and you want to start that conversation, fantastic. Let's do it. I think we were just trying to break it up into smaller questions to get at those strategies if that was easier. But if you're ready, let's do it. We'd love to hear it. Thank you.
So I think at this time, and I do want to make sure, Brad, was your comment before or after this change in direction? Do you still want to speak? And I guess Kathy, the same question to you too. Did you want to speak, or did you have a specific response to the items that Gene had on this slide? Maybe starting with Kathy.
For me, maybe a little bit of both. I mean, I do think it requires a deeper dive of discussion, but, you know, just to highlight at least this slide, I do think all the tools that we've identified are effective tools that would be beneficial for the priorities. To me, I think it's going to be all a matter of timing. You just can't overwhelm the community with too many things at one time. And so the challenge really, I think, is going to be when you implement this and when do you present this to the community. Some of these are going to take a good bit of additional work, and I guess that may be reflective in, you know, short-term, midterm, and that kind of thing. For instance, the park district, going to take an awful lot more work to really drill down on what that's going to amount to and what's needed and what the community would get behind, you know, the various projects that would have to be identified for the community to consider, all of that. I am not in favor of putting this in a midterm 4 to 6 year option for a park district, and the reason being is we have had 2 park bonds over the last 2 decades. Quite frankly, the last one was in 2013. We're really ready for another one now. And, you know, I've had an ad hoc team that we've been having separate meetings with the park board, and Jeff and Jennifer have been involved with that. We've all agreed that the park district is really the way to go, for at least for parks, for sustainable funding. But we think that that needs to get started earlier than a 4 to 6 year out, because with the fact that we're approaching almost 10 years since our last park bond. and infrastructure, a lot of infrastructure issues are going to take some time to develop. And so I would be more in favor of putting that, I don't know, in a 2-3 year out type situation. Again, I think that we really need to determine timing of these issues as being one of the most critical items to consider. That's it for now.
Thanks, Brad. Kathy?
So I'm a little bit confused in that I was not sure that we were identifying specifically because, where would we use the Levy Lift tool? So could that be used for parks? Could it be used for transportation? So I think we'll get there in this discussion so I won't spend a lot of time on that. But I also want to make sure that we are all very much aware of transportation being the #1 need and desire of our community. And in that sense, I think that we can make recommendations as to whether it be a sales tax, but there's public outreach, there's the business community. If sales tax won't work for transportation, will a transportation district work? Will a levy lift work? Will a bond work? I think I want to make sure that the first thing we come back with is that find the tools for transportation, get that approved, and then, and we see what go on. Because I'd hate to see transportation, as important as it is, fail because we wanted it to be a sales tax and we didn't give it any other tools or options.
Thanks, Kathy. Jason?
Thank you, Jamie. So real quickly I would agree with Brad 100%. This is all about timing for me. The way I look at this task force is it's simply just about prioritization, not really trying to pick out projects or anything like that. So when I'm hearing in my mind from the people at the city is, how do you want to do this? So right now, when I think of the Parks District and I think of the TBD sales tax, I think of those as big, blunt tools that can get a lot done. I just don't think there's an appetite for it right now. Everybody's going through inflation. We have situations as far as, you need to just watch the news. But what I see it more as effective tools for this task force are the ARPA funds, are the end funding balance funds, little incremental sales tax here and there. I think these bigger blunt tools need to be pushed out. I think, as far as I'm concerned, as someone who's been here for 20 years, what I'd like to see is our city made whole again with good governance and starting to fill out some of the edges. Right now, like I said, we're still going through a pandemic. I mean, we're still not even meeting in person. So that's what I would prefer to see is how do we use those other tools? We use the big hammer a little bit later, maybe the Parks District in 4 to 6 years, and possibly the TBD sales tax in 4 to 9 years. It was brought up, and I think Councilmember Martz made a very good point, that the one thing I do like about the sales tax, even though I'm not a big fan of it at all, is it at least gets the 50% that use our infrastructure to help pay for it. That interests me, but it also kind of goes against what also was said earlier that meeting, which is we have the highest sales tax, I believe, on the east side. It seems like Issaquah sometimes is following the Seattle model versus the Bellevue model. And I'm not a fan of that. So again, I'm also trying to think is how do we encourage people to want to set up their businesses here? Because right now we're living off the largesse of property owners. It's a big part of this community, the Issaquah Highlands, Talus, and so forth. So that's what I'm trying to be sensitive to right now. Again, I think some of those bigger blunt tools definitely have their time and place. But for me, like I said, I'm kind of looking at some of those smaller options that we have, the ARPA funds, the end funding balance, and some of those incremental, the EMS levy. Again, I think Stacy made a great point about the cameras not being called a revenue source, but that's kind of what I'm looking for because I think people will appreciate the next year or two. Let people get their heads around the inflation. Let people get their heads out of this pandemic. I think right now trying to go to bond, that's a big ask. Right now, when people are trying to down a gallon of milk that costs exponentially higher than what it used to, stuffing it down with some chicken that is much higher than it used to, and then asking for more money from the city. I think right now good governance is just trying to fill out some of those edges. And I think there's other ways to do it. I'm interested to hear what everybody else has to say. I think our priorities are right. Transportation, obviously being the first one. Parks, like I said, our parks are pretty healthy. I think we can safely say that those are probably in pretty good shape, at least for a few years. You know, I'm fortunate enough I get to walk around and see a lot. So that's kind of what I'm thinking. But if you look at the actual last few votes, I mean, I know we talk a lot about the big ambitious project. The only vote that failed was the big ambitious project that was 5 times the cost of the second biggest project, right? So it's $50 million. That failed. And then the other 4 were approved. So I don't know if the community's in a mood for right now for big ambitious projects, especially when they're thinking of their own dinner table right now.
Thank you, Jason. Are any of the comments that came through in response to Jason?
Jamie, I just did want to make one clarifying comment in response to Jason, if I could.
Yeah, and I would just echo, please indicate that. It would really help me to not have to ask that question. If there are comments that are in response going forward, please just indicate that in the chat. Thank you. Gene, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify on the sales tax remark. There was information sent out as a supplement in the packet. Issaquah is basically on par with all the other East Side cities at 10.1% for sales tax, and I believe Kirkland does have a higher tax since they've levied a 0.1% for public safety. So we're kind of on par or slightly below other East Side cities. Thanks.
Thanks, Gene. Robert, you had some comments. We're having some trouble hearing you, though.
How about now?
That's better.
Okay, sorry about that. No, I really appreciate the comments from all the speakers so far. Just a couple technical notes. I know Ms. McCory brought up the having a transportation district, and just a technical note, when we talk about a TBD or transportation benefit district, that's already there. So that's the city is the district. So when we talk about doing either the vehicle license, car tab fee, or doing the sales tax, that's in the toolbox. When you look at other transportation districts that overlap, obviously Sound Transit would be the largest one. And then the other side note just about the ARPA funding. So per the final rule that came out from the federal government last week, the city has until 2024 to expend all that ARPA money. So when you talk about small projects versus large projects, it's very highly unlikely to have large projects that can be, designed and completed within the next 2 years. So that money would be used for smaller projects, if that makes sense, or projects that are already approved and planned by the city. Thank you. That's all I had.
Thanks, Robert. Stacy?
Thanks. I'll be quick. So my sort of interpretation of what Jason was saying, we have the slides that I think we're going to briefly go over later that say bonding for capital versus pay as you go, cash pay as you go. And it sounds like what Jason is saying is kind of a version that we have here, sort of a short-term pay as you go, because we have this influx of funds. I was just going to say that I don't disagree with that approach. And even if it's not projects, maybe this is a question for Robert. Maybe there's an opportunity to use some of that money for design and small projects, or some design for larger projects, and or smaller projects. But I don't disagree with that approach. I think it's one way. I mean, there's a lot of conversations going on about how we can use that money. I'm hoping that the city and the council will focus on the plans that we have in place for several years that we haven't had the money to do, rather than adding things that are new priorities. Anyway, so I was just clarifying my interpretation with Jason. If he's wrong, he can correct me, and I don't disagree with that. Thanks.
Thanks, Stacy. Councilmember March, did you have anything else to add, or was Gene's comment satisfactory?
No, Gene covered it.
Great. Well, one thing I might do now, seeing as we have a little bit of airspace on, is go through how Cynthia was thinking about this, talking through how she would see this strategy come together. And so just starting at the top, she structured it by long-term, medium-term, or sorry, short-term, medium-term, and long-term. And she felt like in the short term, looking at red light cameras, the ARPA funds, and ending fund balance, all towards transportation, and with the red light cameras looking towards specifically traffic safety. In the medium term, looking at the TBD sales tax and levy lid lift, both towards transportation, and with the rationale being that she could combine, or we could combine those two to seek balance between equitable progressive property tax and geographically equitable sales tax to capture Issaquah's non-resident traffic burden. And then in the longer term, looking at the Parks District. And a little expansion on her rationale and strategy was, because it was identified as the first priority, we should give transportation an immediate boost with ARPA and ending fund balance. This should be used towards all costs needed to accelerate projects, including increasing staff capacity to maximize leverage funds available through partners and grants. A boost in resources will help identify appropriate long-term scale investments into the medium and long term. This is a go big but not huge strategy. The reason for not going huge is that we want to focus on building capacity to leverage funds. Going huge and scaling up to accelerate all transportation projects may shift more of the funding ratio from the typical 1-to-6 ratio to something much lower. And I think there she was referring to external federal state funds, but being able to leverage those. And then getting back into her comments, it takes time and patience to successfully leverage the grant cycle routine over time to build large infrastructure projects. The rationale for moving parks districts out to longer term reflects a desire to prioritize that which we've agreed should be tackled first. Once there is success in finding funding tools for that priority, then we can move on to Parks District. I worry that if Parks District is moved to the medium term, it will take focus from the first priority. There's a couple other comments on bonding that we can cover later on in the agenda, but those were her comments on general strategy that she would recommend. Tim, did I miss you up above? Did you have a comment that? Sorry, yeah, a lot of comments in response to Jason. I'm realizing now I might have missed you.
Sort of independent of that, there's been a lot of talk about the ARPA funds. Do we know the amount and timing of the ARPA funds that are available for the city?
Yes. Hi, Tim. It's Andrea. We are going to talk about ARPA funds in more detail later on today, but I can tell you the city received, I think, about $11 million from ARPA funds, and what's available to the task force to consider is $9 million of that.
And what's the time horizon for that, or is there when we are able to use it, or when do we have to use it by? Is there a window there for that?
We can use them today. We've spent some of them already, and Robert just said what the time horizon was, and I already forgot it, but I think it's in the next 2 to 3 years that we have to spend those funds.
2024.
There we go. 2024. We have 2 years to spend $9 million. The question to you is, how should we do that? So if you have recommendations now, we'll also be talking about that in more detail later on tonight.
Sure. And just quickly, I would kind of echo the sentiments that have been shared in terms of priorities, right? So ARPA, the red light, and the ending balance as the first priorities, right? And shorter term, I guess I would lean towards the if we're going to evaluate a levy, a bond, or a sales tax increase, move it, to the 1 to 3 year versus 4 to 6. But in the same order of operations, I guess would be my opinion on that. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. Susan, you have a comment?
Yeah, thank you. I was going to build on some of the comments that were already made earlier. And I mentioned last time, I think that for me, it was easier for me to think about the city's responsibility for maintaining what we have in good working order versus opportunities to improve or expand. And that may be like an artificial way of looking at it, but for me, that was helpful in thinking about what we kind of are obligated to do and to pay for so that we keep this, you know, a great place to live. So, you know, invest in keeping what we have in good working order, and I'm calling that maintain. And then opportunities to, you know, build new things or acquire new things. To me, those are sort of a little bit more discretionary, and they're very important and needed. But I think that for me traces to a different funding mechanism. So for the maintaining, I put out an idea for each bucket. So for transportation, city facilities and assets, parks and trails and utilities. And for the maintain, I really like using the ARPA funds. I think we'll talk about that earlier. And I think that's a great way to think about maintaining our infrastructure. To me, philosophically, that I think would resonate with residents here. And then so for me, that was almost my universal short-term ARPA funds. I do think, though, transportation needs something else on top of that. I'd like to put the bulk of our ARPA funds that we have to work with against transportation, not all of it, because I think the other buckets need some too. But I was in favor of a transportation benefit district sales tax. And I'm saying the word sales tax because that makes me, again, distinguish it from property tax. And that's an important delineation, just at least in my mind. I would also be in favor of that early, so that we can start building up the funds we need to do some big things in transportation down the road. In the medium term, I was thinking the median term in my mind was 3 to 4 years. I think that's consistent with what we had laid out earlier. Is I think we might have to consider now dipping into property tax. So that's where a levy lid lift, I think would be useful. Again, number one for transportation, but the second thing I'd put it against is city facilities. I think we've got, again, some important work to do to make sure that our city facilities are safe, adequate, secure. That's not going to be cheap. I'm not talking about like necessarily a building yet. I think that's a longer term thing, but there are some important things that we need to just keep floating so that we don't get, you know, spam attacks or whatever they call them that, you know, take our city offline, that sort of keep our city functioning. And that's where we may need new systems and new ways of communicating. So I do think that would be worth doing. In the longer term, in the 5 to 6 year, that's where I would bring in parks and trails. And I'm in favor, I think as many others are, of a metropolitan park district property tax. Again, expanding outside of just the city of Issaquah, if we can, to sort of match the users versus the payers of our parks and trails system. And then I also went out into the future. So beyond 5 to 6 years, that's where I think we start to talk about bonds for big ticket items. So all of that ARPA fund, a little bit of a transportation benefit district sales tax, some property taxes, levy lid lift, and then the metropolitan parks district tax would all be in the 1 to 6 years. I think for transportation, we probably need to put out a big bond for a new I-90 crossing, you know, or some big ticket item that would really allow the citizens to kind of say, yes, we want to pay for this, or no, we don't. I think on the city facilities, those two big ticket items that I recall were a new city hall and a new firehouse. And so those are the things I think that are concrete enough that you can get people to say, hey, we want to do this, but it's going to be expensive, and here it is. And then on parks and trails, I don't have that showcase item that I recall, but I'm sure there's a need for land acquisition or some major new development that, again, could be tangible, and that our voters can say, yes, I want to, you know, improve and expand in this area, or no, I don't. I just want to maintain what I have today. So thank you.
Thanks, Susan. Brad, you're up next.
Well, it looks like I'm in the minority here a little bit about the timing of the Parks District, and I can live with that, and I understand that. I guess one of my concerns, Susan touched upon it a little bit, would be land acquisitions. We really can't wait, 7, 8, 9 years out before we can continue to acquire land for future parks. And so that's a concern. And the other concern, as I mentioned earlier, is, we're closing in on almost 9, 10 years since our last park bond. And the amount that the city is actually giving for capital improvements in parks is really not enough to have much of an impact. It's enough to do some smaller things, but not enough to necessarily develop what land we already have to some extent. So I'm still in favor of shortening that up to, or I would shorten it up, just nearer term, because it is going to take quite a while to develop a park district. It's going to probably take another task force, maybe within the park board, to work with the city on that. It's going to take a year or two, frankly, to actually pull all that together. And so I would be reluctant to push that out to the long term to even get started on that, because you could be, 9, 10 years out before you'd actually see any funding. So I just would still want to advocate for that being shorter. Thanks.
Thanks, Brad. Zach?
Yeah, thanks. This is Zach. Just real quick, I wanted to agree with Brad. I had put Parks District kind of in between short-term, midterm, assuming that there is quite a lot of focused effort that's going to need to go into preparing for that, and community engagement to ensure that that's in line with what the community wants as well. I want to push back a little bit on the idea that because transportation is our top priority, that we need a matching revenue source for transportation, because I guess I'm just not following that rationale, because regardless of what new revenue source the city takes advantage of, that in and of itself frees up existing dollars for transportation focused projects. So I think that we can be creative here. We don't necessarily need to pair TBD up first and focus it on transportation projects. That being said, I agree. I just wanted to make sure that everyone is considering that other way of thinking about that no matter what we do, we're freeing up revenue for other projects in other areas, and that could be under any bucket that we'd like it to. So other than that, for short term, I had put red light cameras, ARPA, although I think Stacy brings up an interesting point about red light cameras. I'm kind of two minds on that though, because I think there is a way for us to explain that in the report, that this was an issue that came up, that the committee feels like it is an important public safety issue for the city to consider, and not necessarily coming at it from the direction of this is a revenue source that we want to tap. But from a public safety, actually, that's kind of what Stacy was suggesting, that we keep in the report. Okay, ignore that. I agree with that change. And then medium term TBD sales tax and Parks District is where I was thinking. Maybe Andrea, or someone from staff could clarify what we mean about, do we feel comfortable with Parks District as a medium term or any term option? Does that mean that in 4 to 6 years, the work to consider forming a Parks District would begin then, or the Parks District would be formed then?
I can respond to that. I think when we were taking those polls, we were identifying that time frame as when revenues would start. So that necessarily wouldn't mean that we would not do anything Parks District related until 4 years from now. It was just whatever steps we would need to take in order for revenues to potentially start in the 4 to 6 time frame.
Okay. Yes, then that lines up with how I was thinking about this, especially if we're doing that focused community engagement and focused work beforehand. And are you comfortable with recommending all these tools? I might actually step back for a minute and think a little bit too, because I think Jason brought up a good point earlier in response to, are we comfortable with recommending all these tools? And I'm still churning on that a little bit. So I'll add comment again in the chat if I think of new comments for that. Thanks.
Thanks, Zach. And one thing I would just add, channeling Cynthia here, just because we've had conversations prior to this, is I don't think her position wasn't that we should wait for matching funds. It was just to make sure that we didn't just go out and fund everything before we had the chance to go out and make sure we could get the most for our money. So I think that was just to clarify her point on matching funds. Stacy?
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment about Parks District. I see the value in having it sooner. But we've had criticism and concerns for the years about the city acquiring land and parks, but not considered in those acquisitions and development of parks. And where I mean development, like, you know, adding play equipment and such, is that we haven't ever had a plan for maintaining them. So I would suggest that whatever we do in the report, we add a comment from, I would just suggest to the group that we add a comment about, you know, any parks district plans should also come along with maintenance plans, because it's, you know, it's not any good if you get parks and then you have to scramble for ways to replace turf and, you know, put in new. I mean, we've got parks that need equipment be replaced and turf needs to be replaced, and it seems to be a constant struggle to do that, and even maintaining the lands, just mowing the lawn and, you know, doing the landscaping and taking care of the landscaping. You just don't acquire it and then it just sits there and is beautiful. I mean, it has to be maintained, and that comes with a cost too. So I just think we should note that we should do that with a plan of maintenance if we want to have go out for a create a parks district, or go out for more money, whichever way we decide. Thanks.
Thanks, Stacy. Councilmember Martz?
Thank you. Just to build on that, absolutely, one of the dirty little secrets of municipal government that surprises people is the fact that we don't have capital funds sitting aside for parks maintenance, right? And for basically capital costs in general, right? The city has lots of stuff that we have to maintain, and we pay for it almost all of it ad hoc. So the parks have huge maintenance bills associated with them, particularly like soccer fields need renovation every so often. They're incredibly popular. They're very expensive. We love building them, but then we don't set money aside right away. So I absolutely +1 that we want to talk about that in whatever our final report is about a parks district. The other thing I just want to be clear on the size of a parks district, you know, there is potentially diminishing returns on how large of a park district to do, because we did this, I don't know, 7 or 8 years ago, maybe 6 years ago. And we looked at a park district that was the size of the city, and we looked at a park district that was roughly the catchment of the school district. And I think I mentioned this in an earlier meeting, but what we found was there was less appetite in a larger district, right? So, you know, you can have a stronger appetite in a smaller population, or a smaller appetite in a bigger population, but the amount of money that you're going to get is not, you know, you're not going to get 2.5 times as much money if you have a larger parks district, because the appetite, if you want to put together a proposal that will pass, you have to have a smaller per capita hit on a larger park district than you do on a city park district. So I just want to point that out. It's not a magic bullet. I mean, if I had to guess, like by multiplying the size of the catchment by, you know, 2 or 2.5, you might get a 30 to 50% larger revenue opportunity, just because of the reasons that I just mentioned. So take that for what it's worth. Thanks.
Thanks, Councilmember Martz. I'm not seeing any other comments, so I might just weigh in with my thoughts. Similar to Cynthia and a few others, I do think we should be looking at some of these other short-term tools like the red light cameras, ARPA, and ending fund balance. And I do I think Stacy's recommendation is a good one on the red light cameras, but looking at ARPA and ending fund balance for what, like, in the short term, especially for transportation, what are those things that we need to do to keep the ball in the air? What are the things that we need to do? Someone floated the idea of, is there a way for us to kick off design phases of some of these projects? But what do we need to do in the short term to get quick wins with some of those short-term funds? And then the first focus that I would really have beyond that, based on everything we've talked about around transportation, is really building the strongest case for us to go out and get something passed to fund transportation on the level that we've all said that we, or not all, but we've often discussed being really important. So, I mean, I personally lean towards the TBD sales tax, but I do think that going out, engaging with the community, seeing if that would be preferred over a levy lid lift that's focused on transportation, and really engaging with them to not only talk about what's the tool that we would want to do this through, but also like really starting to get into feedback on the project level around what would get people excited to vote for this. So I do like that's how I would want to approach our number one priority, is kind of all hands on deck, looking towards what is our strongest strategy to go out and get something passed. And that's most likely not going to bond, but that's something we can talk about. But yeah, that would be my first priority. I do think the Parks District is something that after we get through that process, I would love to have us take a look at, but I do think that that's something that would come afterwards, and to a certain extent, depending on how long the transportation focus lasts, that's, I think we could probably start to look into a Parks District, but I wouldn't want us bringing anything to the voters around the time that we would be trying to pass anything around transportation. Yeah, those are my comments. Jason or Susan, I don't know if either of those. Jason, I'll just start with you.
Okay, thanks, Jamie. And I thought all the comments so far have been fantastic. I mean, like I said, I'm definitely not too proud to have my mind changed by people that are just as thoughtful. So the one thing I would say is, again, I think those are great big blunt tools. I think part of it is strategy, right? We might not be the task force that sees this through in 4 to 6 years. They might take our plan and they might hand it off to another task force, and that's okay. And they might look and do a deeper dive in 2 to 3 years. I think the idea right now is we're identifying the things that the city would like us to prioritize. And then again, part of it is just strategy. And I think right now, as the world starts getting a little bit lighter and brighter, we're starting to meet, hopefully all of the stuff passes in 2022, we can start looking, and again, I agree. I think 4 to 6 years, as long as that's when the revenue comes in, I think that's about appropriate, as long as we can start doing some of the legwork within the next 2 years by 2024. I just think, like I said, some of the projects where we can round out the edges of transportation, because again, I think there's ways we can use some of those funds, especially if we have to do it before 2024, right? So that's $9 million, not saying it's all going to transportation, but a portion of that could also go back into the city. Maybe you have a full-time person that's looking for grants and opportunities at the state and federal level. There's just a lot of ways to do it. I think it's just partially strategy. I think Jamie just mentioned that, when do you want to go to the voters with that? Right now, I think would be an inappropriate time. I think you'd get completely shut down. So I think there's ways to fill potholes and, like I said, smooth some of the edges around the city. And then we can start looking. But again, I think the 4 to 6 years with the Park District is about right, especially if you're doing the legwork in the next 2 years to have it set up by 4 years. Again, like I said, I'm kind of torn because Councilmember March left a deep impression on me when he made that argument about how 50% of the people in this city don't live here and use our infrastructure. That struck a big chord with me. But again, my fear is, like I said, we're getting a lot from property owners, and at what point do they balk? Issaquah is a pretty generous area with, as far as our bonds and levies, you can look at the history. So it's, like I said, timing, I think, is a big thing. Strategy is a big thing. And I think, again, even though we might not see it through, and there might be another task force that's built in 2023 or 2024, that's okay. And I think for me, that's kind of what helps me through this process, is I realize this is just the beginning of the conversation and probably won't be the person sitting to help finalize some of these decisions when it probably goes to another task force. So thank you.
Thanks, Jason. Susan, you had a question?
Yes, thank you. And this is really just to make sure that I'm checking my assumption and that I'm thinking about this in the right way. I had a problem with the math in thinking about the transportation benefit district sales tax versus a bond. Like I'm hearing folks talk about, if we go for a bond, it's going to be a real challenge and it's going to be a hard sell at this point. But some of the things that I remember seeing on the needs list, I think is going to quickly outstrip the funding that we could raise. Like for a transportation benefit district sales tax, if we take it up 0.01%, so we just do the smallest available tick up, I think, or close to that. I thought from the prior homework, I saw that that would raise about 1.85 million today. And then of course, I understand you do that every year and it builds and grows. But some of the things that we were talking about, the needs, they were in the tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars. And so I guess maybe that's one factor I'd like to get some guidance from Robert or whoever. Like, it's fine to talk about philosophically, like what you think will be easier for our population to accept but at the end of the day, if we need the money, we've got to focus on those tools that are going to raise those big chunks of money. Even Metropolitan Park District, when I looked at that, I know we can go up to 0.75 is the max, I believe. And so I cut it in half at 0.35. And it looked like, again, from my math, it raised about 4.8 million. Awesome. But it's not 40 million. It's not 400 million. Like, how do we get to that order of magnitude dollars that we might need for those bigger projects without thinking about a bond?
Thanks, Susan. Were you looking for a response maybe from Robert?
Well, yeah, maybe either a correction to my thinking if I'm not, if I don't have the order of magnitude correct, or does anybody else see that maybe challenge or inconsistency of discussing the tactic before we before we associate, well, how much can we raise from that and how much do we need?
If I could respond, and Jean, I have a document I'd like to share, so if you could stop sharing so that I can share and everybody can be on the same page, thanks. So we had provided this in a previous packet. Let me make sure I'm sharing the right thing here, which I think will help because I'm not sure I have the same numbers that you're quoting. So want to make sure that we're on the same page here.
Yes.
The TBD sales tax, as you can see here, potential revenue tools, these are categorized, by bucket, these revenue tools that we could apply towards the buckets. And assuming this rate, I think we had the estimate of annual revenue that it could potentially raise would be about 3.7 million using today's dollars and projections. And then what we did, just to have something to compare it to when we talk about those expenditures in the CIP that are unfunded, don't have grants assigned to them, et cetera, for over the next 6-year period, which is kind of the best glimpse that we have of what our unfunded projects amount to be, that 3.7 million annually would be on average pay for about 80% of those unfunded projects that we can foresee over the next 6 years. Outlying years, when we talk about things like the overcrossing, for example, of I-90, that's going to be a very expensive project. We're going to do our best to leverage as many federal dollars and state dollars and perhaps even other partners as well to be able to fund that. And of course, we don't have any idea of what percentage of those outside dollars that we can get at this point because it is a little bit, it's far away as time goes. But so does that help answer some of your questions? We're looking at the TBD sales tax here, 3.7 million estimated in revenue that it could bring in, and we think that according to the next 6 years under our transportation improvement plan, that should fund about 80% of the projects. Is that helpful? I think that was getting to your question.
Yes. And so, yes, it looks like I was using the numbers correctly. I just, in my calculations, instead of a rate of 0.002, I used 0.001 just to make it to see, a little more palatable and what that would raise. I appreciate the tie to the percent unfunded, but my concern is that the percent unfunded is only, to be honest, like the planning work. And I remember going through that last time or the time before in detail, is like all kinds of funds need to be put against design and planning and preparation. But when it came time to the actual construction of some of those projects in the transportation bucket, that was not included. That was out year. So I guess I feel like the percent funded 80% at 0.002, for example, is sort of like overestimating what we're really getting. And so that ties back to, again, like, I think TBD sales tax is an important tool. I'd like to use it, but on its own, it's not enough. And so I think that's why we either have to do, paired with the lead levy lift, or paired with considering a new bond. And I really wish that we would be clear with our citizens about what they're getting for each of these, especially if we have to go back for their input, because I think it was a little bit of an eye opener for me to see things like, Newport Way construction, or, potential new I-90 crossing, but then say, oh, but asterisk, none of those construction costs are included in here. Those would be in out years. I think they should know that it's big, and this is only partial prep funding, if you will, for that kind of stuff. It's good, important stuff, but I don't want anybody to feel like, surprised that they thought they just bought themselves an I-90 crossing and what they got was the planning for it.
Andrea and Chair, do you mind if I just jump in here for a second and ask Susan a question? I'm fiendishly texting Andrea, and I feel like I should really just ask Susan a question. Susan, when you're doing your math, one of the questions I was asking Andrea was that while we talk about what we look in the first 6 years, the revenue that you could raise through that tool is an ongoing revenue. And if the city were to bond against it, we would collect that amount for 20 years to pay for the project. And so I think it's not just that it covers planning and design, and it's not just that 6 years of collecting pays it. 20 years of collecting that would pay for it. So the dollar, I don't know if we've presented you that number. And Andrea, am I misspeaking on that?
I don't believe you're misspeaking. I think that's correct. The only other thing that I would offer is this is the entire list of unfunded projects we're looking at. There still may be the need to prioritize among that unfunded list, and determine also timing of that unfunded list and when to do that. So that's also something that we would need to do with any funding process and project selection processes. Prioritize and determine timing of those projects.
Okay, that's helpful. I appreciate that. Thank you. I thought I was hearing from this group, though, that there wasn't much of an appetite for transportation benefit district sales tax. I know some people were talking about it in different at different stages. And then other people were saying, no bonds, no appetite for bonds. So I'm just wondering, like, where is the money going to come from? I know we're excited about ARPA. I think that's smart, but if we need additional revenue sources, we talk about Metropolitan Parks District property tax for Parks District, but where are we going to get all the money for transportation if we don't consider these levy lid lifts and potentially going for a bond? I'm looking for a little bit of just thought and direction on, on the one hand, we it's not the right time to go to our citizens, they're going to say no, but on the other hand, yes, we really want to do this stuff.
Thanks, Susan. I have a related question. Is there a difference in the bonding versus not bonding? Is there a difference in the majority required to pass? Because
there is bonds require more than a simple majority. Robert, do you want to go over that real quick?
Yeah, so one of the things is if you're going directly for a bond issue with voters, you need 60%. And actually there's another formula based on the number of people that voted in the previous election. So it's a little tricky. The timing of it is a little different than just say council elections and things like that. So there is more attached to it. I mean, you can theoretically set up a district. You can set up a district with a general district. Say you're setting up a taxing district, and you can bond against it without having to go to the voters at each bond. So that's why it gets a little technical trying to discuss that. And I did have some, and I think the whole group did receive my slides where I said bond versus pay as you go. Just the comment that Susan made regarding the generation, the 20 years. And again, that's generational. If you say somebody's using a road in the perspective of they're going to be driving on that road for 20 years, the debt service would be for 20 years. If you're immediately cash funding it, say you had one-time funding of 10 million to pay for that road, that happens once, but people are going to drive on it for 20 years. So that's kind of the argument. Again, I'm not taking a position, but that's kind of the argument between paying for something in cash now or paying 20 years from now. But again, the dilemma with government is we're very restricted on our revenue sources. So again, when we say what's else out there besides for the bonds, it's getting, interlocal government funding. So getting funding from the state, getting funding from the federal government when it's available. As most of you probably know, less of it has been available over the past few years, and it's more competitive than it used to be. So it's challenging to tap into the same resources. And again, even if you look at our sales tax, the city receives 0.85% back from the state, as I mentioned in the last meeting, out of that whole 10.1% or 10.2% calculation. So again, the city really gets back very little from what you're paying at the businesses in town or on your property tax bills.
Thanks, Robert. Susan, anything else that you wanted to respond or add?
I guess maybe the only other factor is, like, I understand the ability to collect revenues over a long period of time in these certain situations, say like 20 years. If we have, though, a need that is front loaded, concentrated, like we need 25 million right off the bat to do anything, can we do that and then collect that over the next 20 years, sort of, to cover that? Or do we have to raise money for 20 years and then we get the $25 million benefit project?
Say you're doing a bond issue. I try to answer that really fast. Say you're doing a bond issue. Yeah, you can put 10 million in cash up front and then bond the rest of it. So you don't have to do even payments for 20 years. You can structure it any way the city decides to structure it. So you could front load it if you had more cash up front and then lower payments later. Some jurisdictions do that. So that's an option, yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Susan and Robert. I think we had Councilmember Martz. You had the next comment.
Thanks. Well, I'm not opposed to swinging big. Sales tax, bond. But the thing about swinging big, I mean, the voters have said they will take a big swing if it's the right big swing. So ST3, right? Sound Transit 3 voters in East King County supported, even though we're not going to see that for 20 plus years. But they understood what the benefit of ST3 would be. So I think that as a body, we're going to need to make clear, we're going to come out of this with whatever recommendations we're going to come out. I think this idea of swinging big, which a number of us have said in a number of different ways, is really going to be important to articulate for whoever looks at what's going to come next. As an example, we talk about an I-90 overcrossing, right? People would pay a lot to get an I-90 overcrossing. One of the items that's on the capital improvement plan is Highland signal pole painting. People would not pay a lot of money to get Highland signal pole painting. No offense to anybody who lives in the Highlands. So we need to communicate to the folks who are going to put together what some combination would be, that what corresponds. We need a great story. We need to go to voters and say, here's what we want. Here's what it's going to take. And it's not signal pole painting. So we need to communicate somehow what we're saying as a body and what we agree to as a body about how ambitious we want to be and what sorts of things need to be looked at. Because honestly, there's a lot of things on that transportation list that do not move the needle, but are important. And we have spent a lot of money on Newport Way, and we will continue to spend a lot of money on Newport Way. And it's not obvious to me that Newport Way will have a big impact on traffic, but it's a commitment that we made before I was on council, and I've been on council for 12 years. So anyhow, thanks.
Thank you, Councilmember Martz. Tim?
Along lines of Tola's sentiment, but a little different take. I'm getting a sense that we're kind of backing away as a group from, fear that the voters will shoot something down if we're going to them. And my sentiment on that is if we're not going to do something like that in the short term, then what are we doing here? On some level, I think we need to come forward with something that strives to make an improvement and let the voters decide, right? My take to kind of split the differences as we look at a bond, pardon my kid here, I'm on dad duty, but a bond, levy, or tax, whatever the case may be, that funding mechanism is choose one versus, a combination of them. So it'll be a little bit easier pill to swallow. Pick one that's directed at what we're trying to target, that's enough for that. And then, along what Tola's saying is just make it compelling, right? And so the projects and the story are compelling, but we do need to go for something versus just say, let's wait 4 to 6 years, because that's what we keep doing. And so I lean towards action. I love the idea of ARPA, and that'll get us a little bit of the way there, but I think we should take action sooner than later on some bigger projects as well.
Thank you, Tim. And I'm just going to respond to what you said as well as what Councilmember Martz said. And I think to a degree, I agree with you, or to a degree, I agree with you. I think where I would want to see, and this is what I mentioned in my earlier comments, is I would really want us going to the voters and seeing what is a compelling package to them. If we have something that their people are screaming for and we feel like we need to go and build it right away, and then we have the votes to go do that, let's do that. I think part of it is like, because we're not getting to the project level, I don't feel confident enough to say that I don't know if we do or we don't have that package of projects or those big couple marquee projects to say we have that. But that's where I think a separate process, I would love to see us, not necessarily us, but a group go through and really work to figure out what that case is to be made and what is the best fit for the projects. Because I think one of the things I would say in response to Susan's earlier comments is I would rather have $3 million a year going towards projects I think are important than zero because we can't get anything passed. So I do think that there's a balance there. And so that's where I think the community engagement piece of what I said earlier is why that's what I hope we would do is really make sure that we have confidence that we're going out with something that people and kind of measure that confidence and figure out what the right tool is based on that.
I would just real quick comment. I agree with that wholeheartedly. It just goes along with being compelling and having that story and getting as much actual tangible, survey data or voter sentiment as possible. But at the same time, you'll never have enough, right? At some level, there's a leap of faith. What you put forward something you hope is compelling, and then you see on election day. But I would agree with you wholeheartedly, right? Let's do everything we can to make sure that what we put forward is compelling and is a good story.
Thanks, Tim. I think Jason, you had the next comment.
Yeah, thanks, Jamie. And the one thing I was just going to say is again, I don't think anyone here is against bonds or against anything like that. I think for me, it's just, like I said, this whole project for me has really just been providing, to the best of my ability, at least this group, and then this group to the city, a roadmap. Like, what is it, right? I know some people are having trouble, discerning that from the project itself. For me, it's really never been that. And that's kind of where, like they said, the strategy thing comes in real handy for me. Again, I think, to get a lot of the stuff that we want done, of course, we're going to have to go to voters. And of course, these things are going to happen in conjunction with bonds and other things. My whole thing is like, we can give them the direction, say, these are the important things. Transportation's a huge one. Obviously, they're going to choose from the list of projects. But for me, it seems like the next year, at least the next year to 2 years, while all of us are coming out of the ground, again, we're not even meeting in person yet. We have inflation that's been the highest in 40 years. I think you're not going to get the traction people think. And again, I completely agree with Councilmember Martz and Tim. If you want to sell something, it needs to have a compelling story. And I think that time will come. My whole point is like I said, do I think all of these funding tools are important? Absolutely. Do they all have a time and place? Absolutely. For me, it's really just kind of the timeline, right? And the timeline is, when are these things appropriate? And right now, for me at least, the ones that I see that are more appropriate are going to be like the ARPA funds, which expire in 2 years. They're going to be the end funding balance. And they're going to be those type of things that we can incrementally boost while, again, giving our residents a little bit more elbow room as they continue to eat these expensive dinners every night. That for me is kind of it. It doesn't mean that these other things are negated by any means. All of them are valuable tools, and I know they're going to have their time in the sun. It's just, what do we do for the next year or so? I think transportation by far and away is going to be the critical part that we want to see get done. And again, that's kind of where, but I know I heard a comment that kind of said, so are we not talking about that? No, not at all. I think bonds are a big part of the mix. It's just, when is it appropriate, and is it now? I don't necessarily think so. So just wanted to clarify that.
Thanks, Jason. I'm not seeing any other comments. I did want to check in on, well, I don't want to put people on the spot, but if there's a few people we haven't heard from for a little while, Kathy or Parker, I just wanted to make sure there was nothing, that there's been a flurry of comments. There's nothing you want to add. And sorry, Parker, it looks like you're eating right now, so wrong timing. So maybe Kathy, just wanted to hear quickly from you. Is there anything that you would want to weigh in on just from what you've heard?
No, I think everybody has had some really valid points to discuss. I do think it comes, we do have a task to do. We need to complete it. We do need to make recommendations. I think our job is to communicate why we made these decisions to City Council, and City Council to make the compelling argument to the community. So I think all the processes are in place, and as Jason mentioned, I think we're just step one. So I agree with everybody.
Thanks, Kathy. Parker, anything to add?
Right now, I'm really just trying to take in the information, as I wasn't able to attend the last meeting. So I'm just listening to more opinions from different people before I say something of value.
Great. Thanks, Parker. Looks like Stacy, you're up next.
Thanks. So I'm not sure we're going to be able to have a report that ties everything up in a neat little bow and says this is what everybody agrees to. It kind of seems like we're going to have, recommendations that, in my world we call them, majority and minority viewpoints, but it could just be different viewpoints. There was support for this, but there were concerns about this. There were suggestions that, we've heard, you know what I'm saying. I'm a little uncomfortable trying to get a report that seems to be, like I called it, tied up in a neat little bow, because I don't think that's what we have. I also think that one thing is missing is, and we can make a comment about this, is that, we talked about what we would very early on, one or two meetings, the first or second meeting, about our support for things and what we personally think. But I'm not sure we ever did any kind of an analysis reaching out to the community to find out why the last bond measure failed. And so rather than just listening to us, which is just a very, 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 very small handful of people, I would think that that's one thing that's missing. But I think we're going to have a report that is a little bit broader than just, here's our recommendation, 1, recommendation 2. I don't think it's going to be that neat. And I wouldn't want it to be that neat, because it'd be one thing if we were deciding between, one thing or another, or we're a little bit off. But I think there's just too many important considerations, thoughtful considerations, for us to think that that's the goal we should be striving for.
Thank you, Stacy. Andrea, go ahead. You had a comment in response to Stacy.
Thank you. I'm not ready to throw in the towel yet and say that we can't come to some kind of consensus. I do think that there are a lot of considerations in this, and we've asked you to do a really hard thing to come up with this strategy. It has to be an iterative process because every step of the way we're going to uncover more information. And so what I'm wondering is, and I know, Brad, you have another comment, but I have heard some consensus tonight, for example. I've heard consensus on really what should be in the short term. I've heard red light cameras, ending fund balance, and ARPA. It seems I haven't heard anybody disagree with those three things to be considered in the short term. We can talk, different on how we treat the red light cameras, but I'm just kind of grouping those items together for now out of convenience sake. I think where the different opinions really lie is what happens in medium and long term. That's what I have heard the most, and whether that's transportation funding, a vote to the people on transportation funding in the medium term, or a vote to the people on the Parks District in the medium term, or long term for those items. That's where I've heard kind of a divided room. And so I'm wondering if it would be acceptable or worthwhile to the group if, based off of where we've heard the most comments tonight, that we take a few minutes recess and we come up with a poll that shows these different strategy options of what would happen in the short term, medium, and long term, based on what we've heard from you tonight. Come up with a couple of different options and strategies in that way of timing of these tools, and then vote on them and kind of see, does that reveal more of a consensus maybe after we've had this robust discussion than what the discussion itself might reveal. So it's a process question. I'm wondering how you would feel about that. Do you think that's a worthwhile activity that may help provide something a little bit more clear than a summary of your discussions?
I just want to
Stacey, was your comment
respond quickly. I wasn't suggesting that we weren't going to have any consensus on anything. I just think there's value in communicating, when there's not a clear consensus. There is value to not forcing a consensus in everything, and communicating why we didn't, and what the 2 or 3 or 4 different perspectives are. That's all I was suggesting.
Thanks, Stacy. Kathy, you have a question, and Brad, I'm not forgetting about you. Just I'll come back to you, but just wanted to answer any questions related to Andrea first. Kathy, you have a question?
Okay, thank you. My question is, so Andrea, do you think that if we took a break and you came up with another round of questions, that we would come up with a difference from the survey we started out reviewing today? Okay, thank you.
Jason, go ahead.
Thanks, Jamie. So this is just a real quick point of clarification. Mr. Hamoud or Ms. Snyder can answer. It's really just when it comes down to like the TBD sales tax, when it comes down to the Metropolitan Park District, those, when they do show up for voter approval, those aren't going to be tied to a specific project. You can write down in the literature that it might go to transportation, but they're not going to have a specific name. So kind of when Councilmember Martz and when Tim were talking about having a proper vision, see, this is my concern. If you try to toss those out there and all they see is this will help transportation, those big no-name taxes I don't know if there's a stomach for it. Now, like I said, bonding is something completely different. It's tied to a specific project. So again, I think, like I said, I'll quit beating the drum, but for me, it's more about timing than anything. Is that correct, though? Do I have it correct? Bondings would be tied to a completely specific project where the residents could go, okay, that needs to be rehabilitated or built, versus, like I said, these smaller sales tax and the Park District sales tax or property tax, those would be, for lack of a better word, they really wouldn't be tied to anything specific.
I'll take a first stab at this, and Robert, you can tell me if I get it wrong here. I think for anything that would go to the voters, we need to have the transparency and the clarity of what these funds would go towards. And so there are some legal requirements for when you're bringing something to the voters for a bond or for a tax measure. But I think what the city would do is go above and beyond our legal requirements in order to make sure that it's very clear to the voters that they know what they're getting if they were to approve a tax. And so I think that either way, whether it was a bond measure, whether it was a tax measure, that we would make it as clear as possible where these dollars would be going and how they would be spent. And so it would be calling out specific projects, or it would be calling out in a detailed way type of maintenance that would be done, or for a parks district, how it would assist in the operations of the park, and be as clear, transparent, and detailed as possible with folks, because I think it's very important to the city of Issaquah that we are transparent and offer as much information to the voters about what they would be voting about.
Yeah, just to piggyback off Andrea's comments, yeah, same thing. While it might not be legally binding in certain respects, it's certainly, policy matter. A city can go and write, we're going to establish a parks district to do this, this, and this. We're going to establish a transportation benefit district to upgrade the I-90 interchanges, widen Hobart Road. And then you put it in there and you can put a list of priorities and even reports. So yes, you can certainly make it transparent. What is this going to be for? The city can put out, this is the proposal. If it passes, obviously the governing body, whether it's the city acting as the board for the transportation district or the park district, would approve that CIP and be held accountable to that. So hope that makes sense.
Thanks, everyone. I personally, and this is me speaking as Jamie, not as chair, had a response to Andrea. I personally am a bit concerned about a survey at this stage, because I think, kind of to Stacy's point, I think it's going to be really more power to Gene if he can come up with a survey that can fully encapsulate what we've been talking about. But I would be concerned that we'd be trying to fit things in too closely into a box when I don't know if that's been our discussion up until this point. So that would be my concern with going to a survey at this point, is that we're forcing like our perspectives into a box. That part of what my perspective, and I think what I've heard from others, is that we don't necessarily think we need to set the exact process. We want to talk more about a strategy than the specific tools right now to go out and attack transportation, for example. So that would be my concern with going to a survey. And I don't know if I would love to hear your response on like how you were thinking about that survey, but that would be my concern.
What I was thinking about was laying out a couple of options based off of what I've heard the individual task force members say. I've been taking lots and lots of notes from each of you on your preferred strategies that you've brought up this evening. And so what I have heard, as I've tried to kind of compile these, is I've heard, like I said, I've heard agreement on short-term funding strategies by and large. Most people have repeated the same things: ARPA, ending fund balance, and red light cameras. I've heard medium term. I've heard about 4 people suggest some like a TBD sales tax. I've also heard 4 people suggest parks districts, and we're about the same for long term. I've heard I think 3 people suggest TBD sales tax for the long term, and 3 people discuss parks districts should be reserved for the long term. So what I would do would be to kind of break that up a bit and have one option that says maybe TBD sales tax is in the medium term, one option is in the TBD sales tax in the long term, and et cetera, and just see if there's, after all the discussions that we've had, if anybody's opinion has changed, or if there's any kind of coalescing around a preferred option. But if we can do it through discussion, or if there's any other suggestions, it just seems that from what I've heard so far, there's a pretty even division, but thoughts may have evolved through the course of conversation. That would be good to understand. I'm just wondering if there is a consensus to be determined, how we understand that and making sure that we've heard and represent the correct opinions from everybody in the task force. That's all.
Do any other task force members have any comments on thoughts on next steps? Brad, go ahead.
Well, actually, the way I see it, I see this group as being trying to stay high level rather than getting down to the nitty gritty. And you know, I think we've come to a pretty good consensus on short term over the next few years. I really think that it shouldn't necessarily be all in one category, that it should be distributed amongst all three priorities. And I would like to see at some point and this would probably happen, I would like to see the department heads actually making their case in those three categories as to what the priorities are to get a fair distribution of those available funds over the next 2 or 3 years. In terms of midterm and longer term, and I'm in favor of TAB, I'm in favor of the Parks District. We really need to form, as I mentioned, we need to form additional task force to really get down to the nitty gritty of those. And in the course of those activities, that's where surveys and that type of thing would come into play, and assessing, you know, what would really be the, you know, the main items that would be presented to the community for support. I don't really see a park district that much different than a bond in terms of what you would present to the community. It's just that a park district would have more sustainable funds over the longer term, rather than a bond gets used up very quickly. But a similar approach in terms of, you know, we've actually established it through a 20-year strategic parks plan as to what those items are. And so it would probably be established from that. I'm not as familiar with the transportation and facilities if they do have similar things, but that's where you would take it from. So I don't know. I think we just need to kind of decide on short term at this point, and for the midterm to realize that that's going to take a much deeper dive, you know, to really come up with more specifics, you know, in the midterm and long-term range. Thanks.
Thanks, Brad. Stacy?
Yeah, I just want to clarify when I was making my comments about not being forced to drive to consensus on everything. I wasn't speaking on a poll. I'm not opposed to a poll. You know, I mean, it's not to me. I just feel compelled to speak here because I don't want people to think that I'm opposed to that. You know, maybe it brings, maybe it helps us with rooting out the differences and generating more discussion. So I'm not opposed to it.
Thank you, Stacy. Susan?
Yeah, thank you. You know, I was thinking about how I might go about answering Andrea's poll. So it just brings up a question. Between the medium and the long term, like if we're all in general alignment on the short term, let's just assume that for the minute. In the medium and the long term, one of the tools that we talked about is the Metropolitan Parks District. So to me, if I put the Metropolitan Parks District out in the long term, if we put it in the medium term, then to me, it risks undoing what we've already decided to prioritize in transportation, assuming that you can't do both at once, assuming that you don't want to do like a big, you know, tax burden in the medium term for transportation and another big one for metropolitan parks. So it seems like it has to be an either or type of discussion. And I'm starting to hear some conversation about, well, let's make sure that every bucket gets, you know, a chance to get their important items covered. To me, that feels like we're a little bit walking away from that hard prioritization that we made ourselves do earlier, which was built on the earlier community feedback about what's working and what's not, and then what I can't remember what the two dimensions were, but what the biggest dissatisfier is. So I'm wondering what the value of the medium versus the long-term conversation is if it's not, if it's beyond transportation.
Thanks, Susan. Any other thoughts, or Andrea, anything else you'd like to add?
Well, I'm going to again recommend that we try for the survey with the note that if we wind up in the same spot, doesn't reveal any type of consensus, we're going to have to, you know, I guess, go from there. For minority opinions or, you know, where we can't find consensus, we'll certainly express what we've heard today. That's the point of the report, is to be able to communicate all of the thoughts and insights and discussions that you've had in all of these meetings. I do want to convey that the task before you has been from the beginning to consider what are the recommendations for the city regarding the strategy, short, medium, and long term. So we are looking to this group for thinking a little farther out than the next 3 years. That's been the task kind of from the beginning. And I've heard from this group that you've wanted to have a body with the city that thinks a little longer term when it comes to capital projects and how we fund them. And so it's really the unique task of this group is to think about that. And we've spent the past couple of months doing that. And so my hope is that we can come up with some cohesive thoughts, and happy to express all of the opinions that we've heard today and make sure that they're recorded and conveyed to council for their consideration and to the mayor for her consideration. But I still would like to try to see if a poll reveals more of a consensus than what I have been able to suss out through the conversations. That's my humble request, Chair Jamie.
Thanks, Andrea. Yeah. How much time is it, Jean or Juliana? Who would be putting together how much time do you want for a recess to rapidly type a survey up?
7 minutes.
7
I think
minutes.
would be more than enough. That would be enough for us to come up with the poll options and be able to input them into the system, and maybe grab us all a much needed bio break.
Sounds good. See everyone, at least by my clock, 6:55.
Thank you.
anyone that has returned, if you haven't already, please do turn your video back on. That might be your hand raised, unless you're eating, indicate in the chat that you're back so we know when we have people. Great. So it looks like we have everyone back, but the big question is, Jean, are you ready for us? Or Juliana, I don't know who's Juliana. Are you ready for us? Okay. Well,
It's ready.
I will hand off to Andrea or whoever wants to take lead on that then.
I'll take it. So you can see the poll that Juliana has put up in the meeting today, and really it's boiling down to kind of two general questions, and we can talk about these later. I know that there are things that people have brought up that are not in here. For example, facilities is something that Susan mentioned earlier today. Nobody else picked up on facilities or talked about wanting to do something about facilities, so it's not included in these two options. These two options are really a compilation of the majority of the comments that I've heard from you this evening. And so basically the difference with those options is what's in the medium and long term. So as you can see, option A, short term, ARPA ending fund balance, red light cameras, we've talked about that. Medium term for option A is a vote for transportation funding. And what I've done is I've kind of condensed the Levy Lid Lift or the TBD Sales Tax, because I've heard people talk about both. I've also heard people talk about combining those. More than one person has. So I just thought, let's make it simple. We don't need to dive into all the details, tonight. But let's talk about it as a vote for additional transportation funding that would include either the Levy Lid Lift, which is a property tax, or this TBD sales tax, or maybe even a combination of them that was brought up earlier. Also in option A, long term, would be the vote for the Parks District, which is a property tax. And then option B, short term, is the same. The difference again is in the medium term. That puts the Parks District in the medium term and the vote for transportation funding in the long term. And so this is, again, general summary of the majority of the comments that I heard tonight. You may want to embellish upon these in our discussions and please add your comments to these once we get the results of the poll, but I ask that you try to pick which one is your preference out of the two of these, all things considered and having heard all of the discussions tonight. Any questions on the poll itself or the options within the poll? Okay, want to make sure that those are clear. And it's not entirely binding. We can discuss it afterwards, just trying to get a feel for the room. I know I've given you all a hard question here, and Juliana's watching to see how many have responded, and we'll close the poll and let us know what the results are once everybody has had a chance to respond.
I think that's everyone, so I'm closing it. Can you see that? The results?
We cannot.
Oh, okay. Well, we have 8 votes in favor of the short option A. Do you want me to read it?
8 votes for option A. Okay.
And 2 votes for option B.
Okay. Great. All right. So given that, Thank you very much, Juliana. Appreciate that. Thank you, everybody, for having to pick between these two choices. Not an easy thing, and certainly, you know, all along we haven't been asking you easy questions. This hasn't been an easy assignment, so I really appreciate all of your cooperation and the robust discussions and insight you've brought. So with that all said, it seems like there is a majority for option A. What are the comments that you would like to share and your reactions? Is this something that we can put forward in a recommendations report? If you have other things that you want to make sure are documented in the report, it'd be great to hear from you.
If there were an option to put the transportation funding in the first category, the short term, that would have gotten my vote. I'm curious if that would have gotten other votes as well.
Stacy here. I voted the way I did number A because not necessarily because I think that parks should be long term. I voted because I think the priorities are correct. But I think the transportation is a priority over the parks because that's our number one priority right now is transportation and transportation needs. My other comment is not sure I agree with putting in the short term ARPA ending fund balance or red light cameras in there. I'm not sure we want to include that as a funding strategy. I think we want to include it as a side recommendation. The consequence, like I said earlier, the consequence being, if we do have any cameras, then you have revenue and then you can funnel into transportation. So that tripped me up a little bit. I just wanted to make that comment. Anyway, that's the way I voted. That's why I voted the way I did.
Thanks, Stacey. I would echo your comments on where the Parks District came in was more a reflection of priority than I hope that we're in a position that we can do it sooner, but that was the same. I think the only other point of feedback I would have is, I don't know, do you have enough clarity on what we would want the short-term funding from ARPA or from the ending fund balance to be focused on? So that was something that wasn't in there that we might want to talk about and make sure that we're all on the same page with that.
Absolutely, we need to talk about that because I have not heard from a majority of you what that would be. I've heard ideas that short-term funding and I'm sorry, Stacy, I keep talking about red light cameras because that's something that was brought up, but you're absolutely right, and I'll make sure it's reflected in the report because I've heard that from the task force loud and clear. But we haven't talked in detail about what you would like to spend ARPA funds on or ending fund balance, and we haven't talked about that amount of ending fund balance. And so if we are prepared to pivot to that point, then we can move on because there's a couple of slides that just might help provide some information for those discussions. But I want, you know, if there's anybody with reactions to, I think, Tim's question or idea, if there's other thoughts about the poll, I want to make sure we discuss those before we kind of move on to those other more detailed questions that you're asking, Jamie.
Jason, looks like you have a comment.
Yeah, thank you, Jamie. So what I was just going to say is I'll echo what everybody else had mentioned previously, which is, you know, my option wasn't on there. But I tried to vote in the spirit of things, being one of only two. The reason I did it, and is again, because I know our priorities are transportation. But what I feel is like is in the short term, you know, the very short term, we're using those three mechanisms to kind of pay as you go. I don't necessarily think the long term is not doing a TBD. I just think it's more in the 4 to 9 years, whatever that is. And I think the parks, and Brad made a very good point, because we want to acquire this land before either the prices go up or it's no longer available. That's kind of why I put it a little bit before in the 4 to 6 years. So I think I made that when I made my very first comment, which was Parks District 4 to 6, TBD 4 to 9. And I know that doesn't necessarily line up with our priorities, but again, because of the different options we have, I feel like the next year to two, it's really more of pay as you go. And again, there's a bunch of other things we can do for transportation. Again, the few short-term mechanisms that we have still have grants, we still have the ability to bond, things like that. So again, tough to pick between the two, but that would be the reason. That's, I guess, my explanation for why I chose B.
Brad, you had a comment.
Yeah, I guess the thing I don't like about the whole long-term, mid-term thing is that it doesn't, a lot of scoping work can actually occur prior to, when you put something out for a ballot measure. And I guess my concern is if you put something in, if, for instance, the majority is saying long-term for Parks District, you certainly don't want to wait 6 years before you get working on that. And I guess that's my concern, is that kind of pigeonholing these things into these short, mid-range, long-term. I think to some extent there's a way of doing all of them in some respects earlier, than short, medium, and long term. In terms of when you actually time things out, in terms of going to the community in a ballot measure, that's to be determined. I don't think you can determine that now. I mean, I think that you have to really dig deeper into some of these funding tools and surveys with the community, and what the status of our social situation is, like what Jason has mentioned a couple times. So I would really hate to put this in a category as a recommendation of short, medium, and long term, and then think that something that's long term, you just don't touch it for many years. That's what doesn't set quite well with me on this particular survey. Thanks.
Thank you, Brad. Jason?
Yeah, I guess I should have kept going. So the only thing I was going to add was two things. When I still am trying to break down like the buckets and trying to think of the recommendations, I'm still kind of breaking down the 50, 20, 20 for me. So I know we're talking about transportation. It's the big thing in the room, but I still don't see it as it's like the only thing we're trying to fund. I still see it as the majority, like being, again, closer to 50% of what we're trying to get, 20% for parks, 20% for facilities, maybe 10% for utilities. And then the other thing is, one of the reasons I'm a little bit more hesitant as far as the TBD isn't because I think it's a great tool. It's just when, and that's why I kind of keep coming back to maybe 4 to 9 midterm. I just don't know where. I'd like to give Issaquah the opportunity to see more businesses come in. And like I said, we have a lot of small entrepreneurs, but it'd be nice to capture some of Bellevue's lunch. And that for me is kind of a big thing. So as a small business person in Issaquah, that's one of the other reasons that, like I said, it's one I'm a little bit more hesitant to pull the trigger on. But again, 4 to 9 years, let's talk.
Thanks, Jason. Susan?
Thank you. And I actually, I think I agree on with what Tim said. I would consider pulling the TBD right away into the very short term. I know that's not what the consensus is, but what I'm thinking is, okay, so with any luck, we're going to come out of this pandemic. It's going to be 2023, and people are going to start traveling again on the road. They're going to go to their jobs. They're going to, I mean, not everybody, but I think people are going to be eager to get back to normal. And I think it's going to be really quick that people remember how bad our transportation is in the city. And that's an overstatement. And I shouldn't use that term bad, but some of the congestion frustrations, I think, are going to become top of mind again. So the public might actually be primed for conversation about some important ways that we can start chipping away at that, and might be more open to a sales tax at that point than we might think. So that's one thing that makes me think that there might be an opportunity to bring that conversation earlier rather than later. And I think it was really I don't know, resonated with me that transportation was our strong priority, and we should make an impact fast. And whether that can be done solely with ARPA funds, I don't know, but I think we're going to need more funding. And so therefore I would, if anybody else is interested in it, I think we may have an opportunity to do that sooner. Thank you.
Thanks, Susan. My response on to Susan and Tim's comments is, I do feel like even if we were to move as fast as possible, which I do think that we should start the process of evaluating what transportation options we should be looking at immediately. But even if we start that process now, realistically, we're looking at 3 to 4 years almost before at the very earliest we could have revenue flowing. So I think that's part of it. And I don't know if that's just a part of the way that we were responding, but I guess I look at that mid time frame as I would prefer us to take our time on that process. And I think if we were to start now and take our time and be careful through the process, it would probably take 4 to 5 years before you could see that money start to flow. And so that was part of the reason I responded in the way that I did. But that was the thing, is I don't necessarily think we should wait to start the process. I just feel like we shouldn't rush it, and that given timeframes and it needing to go to voters, that it's realistically probably going to take into the midterm anyways. Andrea, I'm not seeing any other comments, so I don't, unless anyone else wants to pipe up, I guess we can probably move on to your next items, assuming you have what you were looking for.
I think I do. Thanks. And so Jean, if you could pull back the slides, put the slides back up, please. And wonderfully, so we have also, this is a good opportunity to do a time check. We did say the meeting would last until 7:30 this evening. It's 7:13 by my clock here. And I think you've already anticipated some of the questions that we were going to ask you, so that's great. So next slide, please, Jean. And we'll just skip through this. I think we've talked about that enough. Okay, so there, I don't know that we need to go to the whole polling function for this, but any thoughts about whether the city should pay as we go or bond? There were some slides that I think you saw in the email that I sent, and there was also in this presentation, if you looked ahead at the presentation. So any thoughts or recommendations people feel strongly, bond or pay as we go, given what Robert has and if has provided? And if you need him to kind of give a 2-minute summary of the information, then he's, I think, prepared to do that.
Andrea, I have a question. Do you want us to use the results from the last poll to talk about the transportation in the midterm, the parks and the long, which one do you want us to focus on, or is it not a specific focus area?
I mean, I think it's a general idea. If you have specific thoughts of, I know that Commissioner Voice has shared his strategy on when pay as we go versus when to use debt, for example, in the timeline. I think that's valuable. It's really just to understand overall what is your desire for the city to increase debt and payment on debt versus and get more stuff done up front versus paying as we go, which is less debt, but we delivering those benefits will be a lot slower. And I think that's the general question, is what's your appetite for taking on more debt versus getting more done? It's an oversimplified version, and I'm sure Robert's squirming in his seat at me, but that's the general question that I would love to hear your feedback on.
Thank you. Councilmember Martz.
Yeah, well, I mean, again, it all comes back to the swinging big, right? But if we had the right package that we thought moved the needle, then I would say get it done. And it's going to be expensive, and nobody wants to wait 20 years like we're going to have to wait for light rail. So for the right package, you're going to get more than 60% of the population to support it. And so I would be in favor of bonding so we could move the needle sooner rather than later and tell people pay for this and we'll have it done in 3 or 4 years versus let's levy and we might have it done in 10, right? Which it's all part of the communicating something transformative to the voters. Thanks.
Thank you, Zach.
Thanks. I was thinking very similarly when it comes to the transportation benefit district in particular. I think that, and if we are considering that as a medium term action, I think it allows, by bonding in coordination with that, it allows us to make a more meaningful impact on transportation priorities. And also with the interest rates as low as they are, I think it's in the best interest of the community to take advantage of this opportunity when we can. When we start thinking about longer term or just the Parks District in general, I think it's kind of harder for me to provide input on what direction would make the most sense, especially because we don't really know what rates will look like then. So anyways, that's kind of what I'm thinking right now. I mostly thought about bonding when it came to the TBD sales tax. I think that it would make more sense, especially given the load of transportation priorities that we have. And if we do want to think big and we do want to make a meaningful difference in people's lives for transportation, that makes sense to me, and it seems to be in keeping with community priorities.
Thanks, Zach. Brad.
Well, my answer to this question is maybe a little of both, and also it depends. I think that in all three categories, we need to find a sustainable solution throughout many years, and yet within various projects, there may be high ticket items that would require a bond measure to accomplish it sooner. So that's sort of, I guess I'd say both. If you need $20 million for a specific project within a CIP, you may need to do a bond measure to actually accomplish that. Whereas if you only need $4 million annually, that is unfunded over the course of a 6-year CIP, a pay-as-you-go makes sense, and a more sustainable solution makes sense. So I guess, to me, I guess that's why I'd say it may require a little of both.
Thank you, Brad. My response would be a little bit of an amalgamation of everyone's comments, but I actually think it's really hard to answer that today, because I think part of this will depend on the projects that we think are part of a compelling package. Because if we have a package of projects that require bonding and that people are really excited about, we should probably go out and do that, and we feel like we have support. But if the funding needs match up with something we can do through a levy, maybe that's the route we should go. So I do think part of my response would be I would really, it's hard. I mean, my guess is we probably could use the money up front and go about it that way. That's the the easy answer. But I would be interested in what is the difference in timing and how would those funding needs look for a package that we think is really compelling. So yeah, sort of it depends, but yeah, to Councilmember Martz's point, if we have a package, we think we need the funds up front, we think we have support, or not, we think we've gone out and established that we have support as a city for that, then I think we should do it.
Great, and I think that's just the level of feedback that I was looking at from folks. So unless there's any other burning desires to comment or strong opinions, I think we can move on to the next question, if that's all right. Great. So ARPA, we've talked about ARPA, $9 million available for this task force to consider. how we can deploy that immediately for infrastructure. And really the question is, how should those funds be spent? We have three categories that we've been really, three buckets that we've been really thinking about throughout our discussions: transportation, parks and trails, and facilities. Given the other financing tools that we've talked about, we've really largely this evening so far been focusing on transportation, the number one priority that you've determined, and the Parks District, which would of course be a dedicated revenue source for parks and trails. Haven't talked much about the other bucket, which is facilities. And so just wanted to make sure that we're considering about all of the priorities that you've discussed. And I'm wondering, between those financing tools that we've discussed and how ARPA would help fit in to that strategy. We have 2 years to spend these $9 million. Should it all go towards transportation because transportation is the number one priority? Should it go to parks? Should it go to facilities? Or should it be maybe spread across those categories? I think I heard a task force member suggest something like that earlier this evening. So any comments about how ARPA funds should be spent over the next 2 years?
Thanks, Andrea. Kathy?
So I remember back when we weren't supposed to actually be looking in the buckets to see what was in there or anything. So I'm just going to make a couple of high-level comments. $9 million in the grand scheme of needs is not a lot of money. Somebody commented earlier about getting more businesses to relocate and things like that. I look at the quality of life during our winter months when we have power outages and things like that. And I think that some of the ARPA money needs to really be looked at for facilities, because we haven't spent any time or earmark any sort of specifics for facilities. But if we don't do something to improve our power grids, our water supply, our connectivity in our community, no matter how beautiful our parks are and how much we build up transportation, there's going to be a quality of life missing. And I think that ARPA has a chance to help make a difference there, because some of the facility projects are probably a little bit more doable with that small amount of money. And I don't disagree with sharing the wealth, but again, not looking into the buckets and seeing what kind of little projects can be done with $9 million. I'm just throwing 2 cents up in the air, so to speak. Thank you.
Thanks, Kathy. Tim, you're up next.
My recommendation for the ARPA funds, as I think about it, at $9 million is predicated on the idea that it can be applied towards things other than transportation, and then in some regards the wizards in the council can move it around. But there's 3 things that come to mind that I think would be doable. You could do all 3 with that amount of money. First would be bolstering our public safety and police. We've seen a rise in all types of property crimes all over the city. And hopefully that would be something that a temporary increase would have a positive impact when we talk about quality of life. I think to Brad's point about land acquisition was really well made in that the available land to acquire is going to go down and the price is going to go up over time. And so if some portion of that can be allocated for the here and now, my philosophy oftentimes when it comes to parks and green spaces is the acquisition is often more important than the development of it. We don't necessarily need to go develop something that's been, left in a natural state for all time. And perhaps there is some slice of it that could be applied there. And what was the third? The third thing was, I mentioned one time before, the traffic management system that had a ticket under $2 million that would have a real tangible impact, and something where it wouldn't rise to the level of being included in a bond package necessarily, something you might look to fund with a funding mechanism like this, where a one-time investment could actually pay dividends. for our citizens. And so perhaps allocating it towards a few smaller budget items that have a real tangible impact would be the best use of the funds.
Thank you, Tim. Brad?
To me, this question is all about timing and feasibility. I mean, how much can you get done in 2 years? Not a lot when it comes to planning and creating, creating something. And so, I guess the way I would look at the three priorities, what I would suggest would be to maybe take the top 2 items that would be feasible within the next 2 years from each category, and then decide from there as to, how $9 million could be distributed and actually accomplish those items. So I don't look at this particularly as much as just because transportation is the top priority that I would put everything into transportation. Because there might be some really strong needs elsewhere, where that money could actually really accomplish something and fulfill a greater need rather than to try and fulfill a greater priority. Thanks.
Thank you, Brad. One quick question, just as we're coming up against time. Andrew, is there one more question after this?
I believe so. I believe it's on ending fund balance.
Okay. I just wanted to check in with, is everyone okay with running a little bit over time? Is there anyone that has concerns with that? Okay. All right. Next up, I think, was Susan. And if I'm wrong on that, please let me know.
Yeah, thank you. With regard to ARPA, just really quick, I think I mentioned earlier in the evening that I think we should seriously look at spending some of that money on necessary systems upgrades for the city. I do worry a little bit about some of the potential for security risks of not having our city systems or government be able to run as it is today if we don't have better systems and security in place. So I'd like to suggest that we look at facilities, even though we haven't really been talking about that at length tonight, but specifically for some of these short-term ARPA funds. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Zach, you're up next.
Thanks. So I guess the way I was thinking about it was these $9 million, again, like was previously stated, it's not really a whole lot of money. I really liked the idea of others in this task force about, well, maybe there are ways that we can focus on the design element of projects with this funding. And the way I'm thinking about it is if we focus on maturing transportation projects by funding design elements with this money, then we help build the story for a transportation benefit district sales tax and potential bond issue to go along with that and show more meaningful progress sooner rather than later because projects are ready to be acted on with dollars that are coming in. So I guess that's where I'm thinking about this. I think secondary though, I'm interested in exploring this concept more about facilities, and maybe there's something to be said in the report that the task force recommends that the city analyze existing and immediate needs in facilities improvement that these $9 million could be used for as well, because the city could think that that is a better use of these dollars than maturing transportation projects and getting ready for that midterm funding with the TBD sales tax. So anyways, I don't know if that was helpful, but transportation, and then interested in exploring where are those immediate needs from the city on facilities.
Thanks, Zach. Councilmember Martz.
Thank you. Yeah, there need to be some kind of sifting that would occur because we don't have, the CIP doesn't have these projects prioritized. They do have some of them sequenced in terms of year, but that sequencing doesn't necessarily reflect priority. It reflects when we think we can get started versus when we think we need partner dollars. So I just think we should recommend that I think the question in front of us, is it just transportation or is it transportation plus the other pieces? And I think that, we should provide guidance on how to stack rank prioritization. And if the transportation pieces come out is the most important overall, fine. But if some of the other parks and facilities rank highly, great. I think we should just give guideline, and the administration or another public body is going to have to figure it out, because it's not, we can't, there isn't a way to say, like, take the top two, each of the three categories. It's not, CIP is not structured that way. Thanks.
Thank you. Jason, you're up next.
Great, thanks, Jamie. So along the lines of Councilmember Marks and Councilmember Hall, as well as Tim's comments, I think those were all great. I really appreciated Tim's because, again, 9 million isn't a lot of money. It's a lot of money for me, but it's not a lot of money for a city. But I kind of agree with Councilmember Marks, right? So transportation is something that's obviously top of mind. So again, this is non-scientific by any means, but I almost feel like, 4.5 can be dedicated to transportation because, again, this is just my opinion. I'm kind of the mind for the next year to two, while possibly we're building something, whether it's a TBD sales package or whether it's a bond. Well, those next year or two, maybe 4.5 million can go to kind of smooth some of the edges as far as our transportation needs, whether it's filling potholes, what have you. Tim's comment about the grid, all of those are great. And then possibly using the other half. And again, I kind of thought the same thing with facilities, because I think the parks kind of take care of themselves in essence with the Metropolitan Park District. So facilities here could get a boost because 4.5 would actually go quite a little bit bigger way as far as helping maintain some of the equipment and facilities that the city has. So here's an area where we can take the facilities, which again, we haven't really talked a lot about, where you might see some tangible benefit right up front. So that was kind of my thinking is, again, you can take half, smooth the edges of the city as far as transportation for the next year or two while we're getting ready to do something on a bigger scale. And then again, the other half possibly go into facilities and kind of using it in that manner. And I guess in this essence is, I guess I'm kind of putting the parks out of mind when it comes to this money. So thank you.
Thank you, Jason. My comments would really closely match Councilmember Marks. The one addition I would make is I would love to see one of the projects or one of the things that's funded coming out of these ARPA funds being a big kind of statement on the climate action plan. I do think that's something new. I think there's something that it could be facilities related, but is there some project that we could bring to show the city, the rest of the people that in our city that we're really serious about our commitment to reducing our carbon footprint? So that would be the one addition that I think there would be. We haven't talked about that. That kind of goes across a lot of these categories, but is there an opportunity there to do something that's going to make a big splash and that we could point to as this is showing the city's commitment to the climate action plan?
Great, thank you. I see that Stacy had to leave the meeting. I'm wondering, Jamie, if you want to read her comment so that it's on the record as well.
Yeah, so Stacy said, "I'm sorry, but I have a family commitment that I cannot ignore." And we may just follow up to make sure that there weren't any comments that she had on any of these, especially this final item, since she won't be here.
And
There's a comment above that.
Yeah, there's another comment on input on the ARPA money.
I have not scrolled down far enough. There we go. Yes, I will read that comment. That is the more important comment. Here's my comment. I had mentioned this while on council this past fall. We should use some of the ARPA money to treat the community after a long pandemic. For example, we have plans to redo Tibbetts Valley Park. so we can put money into that or some other big bang benefit, something visible and for the entire community. We should also look at smaller projects across the buckets.
Okay, so I have heard a lot of different things about how ARPA funds should be spent. I think if we were to pick out the mode, the most commonly cited items, I've heard transportation and facilities. At this point, for the recommendations report, I'd love to cite that there's that mode or that common that's what came up the most often, but also include some of these other ideas for further discussion and for council's information. Is that acceptable to the group?
Yeah, Andrew, the only thing that we might add is what Councilmember Marks said around just kind of not necessarily being, even though we're saying those categories, it being something that it's not hard and fast, or I don't want to put words in your mouth, but that we might need to think about it slightly differently than just trying to prioritize based on these buckets.
I guess what my point had been is that we need to prioritize absolutely. In other words, not just what are the priorities within each of the three buckets, but somebody needs to prioritize across buckets as well, right? And maybe it's, you know, maybe there's 6 things and 3 of them are transportation and 2 of them are parks and 1 of them is utilities. I don't know, right? I don't know how it shakes out, but it just, I would hate to put quotas into each of the 3 buckets. I want to give the administration the latitude to see what would work, particularly around some of the comments that we've heard addressing climate action and addressing parks. You know, that might not shake out if we quoted each of the 3 buckets.
Okay, great. Well, then I think we have the last slide here for ending fund balance. And so our current policy keeps the ending fund balance at 15 to 20% of the general fund expenditures for emergencies or for things that come up that are unforeseen. You know, we looked into tapping into this 15 to 20% for responding to the pandemic, for example, in 2020, right? So we have kept that for emergencies, as I think was said in a previous meeting. 15 is probably about normal for a city of our size and complexity in terms of the services that we offer. 20% is north of normal or average for a city like us. And it's more rare to find a city that has 20% of their general fund expenditures in reserves. And so giving you an idea of what this amount could be given the policy in the reserves for any given year, based on the 2022 budget, that's $9.7 to $12.4 million. So you have a scale of understanding of what that is. And it was brought up in a previous meeting, which is why I wanted to bring it back to you for your consideration today, is should we consider maybe changing that policy? Would the task force recommend instead of 20%, maybe the ending fund balance should be kept at 15% and make that more of a hard number instead of a range? Should it be 17%? And I have the numbers for that. Let me pull them up in they're in a different place here. So for example, if you were to recommend that that the city hold in reserves only 15%, what that would do is it would free up. I'm still searching for the number, just a second, sorry about that. That would free up about here we go. So if it was 15%, that would free up another $2.1 million this year potentially that could be diverted into infrastructure instead of being held in reserves. If you said maybe instead of 20% or 19% it's 17%, then that would allow $1 million to be diverted into infrastructure instead of kept in reserves. And so I'm wondering, should the city consider dedicating a portion of the ending fund balance to help fund infrastructure? And if yes, are there opinions on what that percentage would be? At this point, the administration would advise against going lower than that 15%. I think we'd like to retain at least 15% for emergencies, but if there's another percentage within that 15 to 20%, we'd love to hear your opinions.
Thanks, Andrea. I have a question. What happens to that money? Like, assume we say no, that we shouldn't fund infrastructure. What typically happens with the funds today?
Go ahead, Robert.
I'll try to jump in. It remains unspent. It remains what we call unassigned. It can be used, obviously in a rainy day, but it has to be subject to council appropriation at a later date. But if it's not used and it's not programmed, then yes, it would carry over year to year.
Thank you, Robert. Zach, do you have a comment?
Sure, and just a little bit more context too. I mean, this bucket of money is incredibly important for the council to be able to respond to emerging needs as they show up during budget season, and also to respond to emergencies. So that's just some more context for why it's there. Also, right now, I believe when we adopted the 22 budget, we ended it at 19% for the express reason that this task force might make a recommendation for that remaining 4%, and that it might be used for infrastructure too. So I just wanted to make sure that that was out there too. I do think that actually I would be interested to know if we're above 19% now. I know it's only really been a month, but I'm sure we'll get kind of a status update on finances sometime this quarter. But I do think that that remaining 4% should be used on infrastructure. What it's used on, I'm not sure, and I don't think it's important for us to necessarily have a specific use in mind either. I think saying that it should be used on infrastructure is a perfectly fine piece of feedback to give the council as they move forward. Because again, things could happen when they start considering these recommendations. There could be emerging priorities and higher needs for those dollars as they arise. So I do think it's not necessarily as important to get super specific on this one. Thanks.
Thank you, Zach. Councilmember Martz, then we'll circle around to the others.
Sure, we never get down to 20%. That's been the historical challenge, and we're trying to do things differently this year, but we always shoot for 15 to 20, and we wind up at like 25 to 30 to 40. What this would do is, if we had this policy, we would just take some money off the beginning and target a slightly lower ending fund balance. I suspect we'd still have challenges with getting down to that number. There have been a lot of conversations over the years to do various set-asides. We had been conversations about set-asides for street repair. There's been conversations for set-asides for sidewalks. Ultimately, it's hard to bind the council because, quite frankly, the council only does two things, right? We write laws and we write checks. And the budget is the biggest thing we do in a given year. And this body could give some guidance, but just understand that, the council's going to do what it's going to do on a budget. But, guidance would be appreciated and factored.
Thank you, Councilmember Martz. Brad, you're up next.
I don't have a whole lot of history on this question in terms of how frequently this money, kind of reserve money in some respects, is ever utilized over time, but that would be interesting to look at in terms of how often you need to dig into this fund to pay for emergencies historically. But overall, I mean, I would look at this fund as just for emergency, urgent things that there's no other funding source that can take care of it within the next year or two, and use it accordingly. I mean, and that might be relating to facilities or transportation. I mean, that's where your most urgent needs are likely going to occur. I would not look at this very loosely in terms of trying to pull much from here to develop long-term infrastructure type things. Thanks.
Thanks, Brad. Susan?
Yeah, thank you. My question was actually very similar to what Brad just covered, but you mentioned, Andrea, that for instance, an example of an emergency is a pandemic. So in that situation, did we use up all of the reserve? Is that a good example of, you know, an emergency that would use it all? Or did we not even use all of it? Or did we use way more than we even had? Like what's the order of magnitude of like the pandemic?
Great question. And actually it's more complicated than a simple answer, but I'll do my best. So I think in 2020, when we really did not know what was going to happen with the economy and what to predict, we thought that we would have to really dip into the ending fund balance to help with these emergencies and respond to the pandemic based off of the best predictions that we had for revenues. What ended up happening, and we made significant budget cuts as well, just to prepare for what we thought was going to be a big drop off in revenue. And instead, what we found is that with all the Issaquah residents largely staying home and not going anywhere, instead they went shopping at Costco, and they went shopping at Home Depot, and we saw we didn't see the dip in revenues that we had feared earlier on. So it ended up being, after lots of hard decisions with this city and the city council trying to manage the budget against, you know, unknown conditions in the future, we ended up not dipping into that ending fund balance. So we were prepared to do it at one point. And the city has never spent all of our reserves. There, I think, have been maybe some times we've needed to dip into it a little bit for different emergencies that come up. But by and large, as what often happens is at the end of the year, when we true up what are our actuals compared to what we budgeted, we find that that we have underspent on our budget instead of overspent, and have not really needed to dip into the reserves. That's more of the trend.
Well, thank you. And so based on that, I think I would be in favor of treading a little bit more lightly and I guess toward the 15%, if I'm understanding this correctly, and then use some of that difference for infrastructure. I think it's a good idea, as long as we feel fairly confident that the 15% will still serve us well for emergency flexibility. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Tim?
Well, I appreciate the context with this one, because as I heard it named as a early funding source earlier, it seemed to make sense. But as I hear it and get more context, I think I want to sort of change my position. I would be wary to change what's just kind of good fiscal governance and tap into something that's an emergency fund, unless there's some economic condition or a life and safety issue. What we saw recently with the landslide on Newport Way, right? We're in an area where something like that could happen. Maybe that retaining wall behind Fred Meyer would rise to the state of something more pressing, and that would require the use of sort of these emergency funds. But if I'm doing my math right, maybe you'd get a $3 million pop out of that. And since it rolls from year to year, you'd really get that one time, but it would kind of hamstring you in perpetuity. So I would be wary to dip into this for infrastructure and just leave our a little bit more conservative governance in place.
Thanks, Tim. My comments on this, I feel like we should be leaving this in the hands of council ultimately, obviously, but I do think we should encourage, if we feel like we have more than a buffer, and I don't want to give a number of what that buffer is, I would encourage council to look at investing in infrastructure and seeing if there are things that can really make a difference in the community. I mean, we've talked about the priorities that we have. I don't think those priorities will change over time. I don't think it has to be that kind of rigid, but yeah, if we're ending it like Councilmember Bartz was saying at 35%, 40%, maybe we should think about that. And so I hope we would give council the kind of freedom to go and do that. It seems like a good potential use of surplus. Jason, I think you're up next.
Great, thank you, Jamie. Going to piggyback on what you said, and I do appreciate Tim's comments because, again, I would rather have a healthy reserve than a struggling one. And the retaining wall behind Fred Meyer is a perfect example. God forbid that should ever have a problem. But no, I think when you hear that it's continually over 25%, that's great. And I don't want to damage that, but it wouldn't be, I don't think if you shot instead of 20% and we continually are hitting above average, if you drop the number down to 18 or 17.5, and then again, leave it up to the discretion of the city council. But things like what Tim had mentioned earlier, the street light programming, which might cost $2 million, that could take care of that 1 year. So I think, like I said, I'm hopeful. Sounds like the city is doing a very good job as far as being whole. But shooting a little bit lower, and instead of pulling in the 25%, maybe you're pulling in the 21%. I'd say that's still healthy, and then that money could be used by city council, again, not to fund long-term projects, not to do anything big, but just little holes. And like I said, sometimes when the city sees something good or the administration sees something good, like programming the lights, those one-time funds could be a good shot in the arm. So I think I'd feel comfortable with the city being maybe a little less conservative. Again, happy to hear that we're punching above our weight continually, but that's a sign that maybe we can bring it down just a hair. And if it goes from 20, split the difference and call it 17.5, I think we'd be all right.
Thank you, Jason. The one other thing, and this is mostly Cynthia talking, but the other thing that I think would be a really interesting use of that if we have surplus ending balance is looking in the next year for actual operating expenses that might be able to leverage, like someone that's going to write grants that'll help with infrastructure funding. Are there operating expenses that we are not skimping on, but that we could invest in more heavily that would have benefits for infrastructure capital projects? I think that would be a really compelling use of those funds that is related to infrastructure, but not directly. Zach, you had a question?
Yeah, just a quick clarifying question of our new CFO, and that is, I'm hearing like the word conservative used a lot right now. So would 15% of expenditures be considered in your mind a healthy fund balance?
It's so funny. There's in the finance or public finance realm, anything that's 15 to 20%, even in that range, is really healthy. I've actually been told before by some of the bond rating agencies that obviously we issue our bonds that upwards of 20% is a solid fund balance. I mean, that being said, is 15 enough? What is your reserve? Can you pay for downturns? I think 15 is healthy if you can sustain that. So anything in that range would be acceptable, certainly acceptable, and stronger than some other comparable communities, of course.
Okay. You certainly bring up a different consideration that we haven't talked about, which is its impact on our bond ratings. So I think that this group would probably be unanimous in telling the council and the mayor that we don't want to do anything to impact our excellent bond ratings. So maybe that can be included in our feedback about end fund balance. Okay.
Thank you, Robert and Zach. I'm not seeing any other comments. Andrea?
I just wanted to ask a clarifying question from Brad, because I'm just not sure that I fully understood what your comment was. So can you maybe repeat yourself for me and clarify what your opinion is on this?
On the ending fund balance? Basically, urgency, I guess, was the bottom line of it. Is that if there's something that is very urgent that the city needs in terms of, and I guess facilities brings to mind, or transportation, if there are items within the next year that you don't have those funds available to fulfill that urgent need, that's what this reserve account, I think, should be used for, rather than for any kind of longer term infrastructure development. I mean, to really use the funds for what it's designed for, and if you don't have any urgent needs, then you don't know what can develop over the course of the year. I mean, that's the whole purpose of having a fund like this. To have a healthy fund available for something. I wouldn't touch it. Bottom line, I wouldn't touch this fund for any longer term infrastructure desires, I guess.
Thank you, Brad. And Jason, looks like you have a comment.
Yeah, and I think Susan brought it up earlier, Jamie, and she had mentioned, part of the infrastructure is also safeguarding some of our things. I know one of the capital projects is something simple as access cards. So again, I kind of see that if whatever the number is, I think Mr. Hamoud brought up a great point, which is we don't want to, or Zach did, sorry, Councilmember Hall, but as far as not hurting the bond rating, but if that's true, and again, they come up with a number, whether it's 2%, 3%, getting closer down to 17 or 16. I almost see it as like a shot of B12, right? It's just a shot in the arm. It can help a particular situation. Again, this isn't designed to be running in perpetuity with another project year over year. It's just something that, again, the city can take a look at and see where they fell short in 2022, or again, a specific need that falls within that amount of money that the city can, discretionary, as far as the council be able to go, okay, we can take care of that with this. So yeah, that's just kind of how I see it.
Thank you, Jason. Andrea, do you have what you need on this question?
I think so. I've heard from the majority of you, yes, maybe dip into somewhere between this 15 to 20%, be cautious and prudent about that, don't affect the bond rating, for example, spend on urgent needs. That's generally what I've heard from the group. Is that accurate? Getting some nods. Okay, great. Thank you. So that's what I'll include in the report. And I think that's the last question that I have for you this evening. Oh, well, technically I have one more. If we're ready to move on, I think to the.
I was going to ask other business and announcements. Is that where you have something for us? Okay, go ahead.
Yes, but this one should be the easiest question you answer all night. So I think we're done with the hard stuff. Thank you so much for all of that and sticking with me through that and for adding on to the extra time. So next question is, our regularly scheduled meeting would normally be next Tuesday, February 1st, just a week from yesterday, I guess. A problem with that is that we have been having conflicting calendar issues with council. Some of the council meetings have moved around. I don't need to bore you with the details of why that has occurred, but obviously we have several members of council on this task force, so we want to avoid that conflict with the city council meeting. I am wondering if this group would be willing to instead reschedule to February 8th. So instead of next Tuesday, the 1st, to consider 2 weeks from now, February 8th. Great. I'm getting a couple thumbs up, and that would be at our normal time from 6 to 8.
Are there any, oh, Jamie, do you mind if I ask a quick question?
Go for it.
Are there any implications, like, are you worried at all about, in case we might actually need another meeting more than planned to get everything squared away before it's presented to council? I mean, do you have any worries about potentially waiting another week before our next meeting?
I don't, and you know, I think that it's possible that if we do need yet another meeting before the recommendations are complete and you all are comfortable with those, then we can try to fit that in, and we would just postpone that final meeting with Mayor Polly, and so I think we can fit it in.
Okay.
So thank you for asking that question. Also, just to be honest, it's going to be really helpful to me and to Jean in writing the report and not having to do that in the next 48 hours. So okay, looks like there's consensus around the 8th. Thank you so much. Juliana will have that scheduled, and we'll send out the link and invite. So February 8th from 6 to 8 will be our next meeting. Thank you for that. And again, very much thank you for this great discussion tonight. We covered a lot of really hard items, and there was a lot to consider when you're forming your strategies and thinking about it. And I'm continuously impressed with this group and the level of thinking and insights from you. So I just really appreciate it. Thank you. And when we send out the recommendations report, this is your opportunity to make sure that I'm summarizing your comments correctly. So no ego of mine attached, rip it apart, make sure it's accurate, and we will discuss all of that next time.
Thank you, Andrea. Then I think with that, we are adjourned. Thanks everyone for your time, and have a good rest of your night.
Thank you.
Thank you.